Hello everyone, welcome back to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. Secrets of the Silent Town. The first warning came with the whispers. Emma Larson heard them first, a hushed chorus of voices murmuring just beyond her bedroom window. Not words exactly, more like the echo of words spoken long ago. When she looked outside, the street was empty. The next morning, her neighbor's teenage son was gone. Just vanished between dinner and bedtime, his half-eaten meal still on the table. That made 14 disappearances in Hollowbrook in 5 years. Officer Dan Harris rubbed his tired eyes as he pinned another photo to the map in the precinct basement. 14 faces stared back at him, each connected by red string to a location within 5 miles of the town square. The pattern was undeniable now, a perfect spiral radiating outward from the abandoned train depot at the edge of town. "The dream started again last night," said Mayor Wilkins, his hands shaking around a coffee cup. "Same as before the Miller boy disappeared. That, singing from the woods. I first came to Hollowbrook as a freelance journalist, drawn by the strange cluster of missing persons cases. The town welcomed me with forced smiles and sideways glances. At the diner, old man Peterson warned me not to ask about the quiet times, those strange hours when the birds stopped singing and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The disappearances always followed the same pattern. First, the static. Every victim reported strange interference on their phones and radios in the days before they vanished. Young Sarah Withers had recorded 3 minutes of it before she disappeared, a pulsing, almost mechanical hum that made my teeth ache. Then came the shadows. Not ordinary darkness, but shapes that moved against the light. Mrs. Calloway swore she saw them circling her grandson's house the night he went missing, tall, slender things that flickered like bad reception. Finally, the silence. A hush so complete it felt like the world had been muted. The trees stopped rustling. Crickets ceased their nightly chorus. Even your own breath seemed to disappear. That's when they took you. The truth came to me in the Hollowbrook Historical Society archives. Buried between census records was a single yellowed page from 1937, detailing an incident at the old train depot. Something about a containment breach and unexpected auditory phenomena. The report was signed by a Dr. Elias Vogler of something called the Parapsychological Research Initiative. Last night, my radio turned itself on at 3:17 a.m. Through the static, I could just make out something breathing. And beneath that, the faintest sound of singing. The static's been getting worse all morning. My reflection just blinked at me. Outside, the wind has gone still. I think they know I'm getting close. I can hear the whispers starting again. Found handwritten note tucked in Historical Society records, author unknown. Story 2. A flight into Texas. The flight and extradition of Charles F. Dodge unquestionably involved one of the most extraordinary battles with justice in the history of the criminal law. The funds at the disposal of those who were interested in procuring the prisoners' escape were unlimited in extent, and the arch-conspirator for whose safety Dodge was spirited away was so influential in political and criminal circles that he was all but successful in defying the prosecutor of New York County, even supported as the latter was by the military and judicial arm of the United States government. For, at the time that Dodge made his escape, a whisper from Hummel was enough to make the dry bones of many a powerful and ostensibly respectable official rattle and the tongue cleave to the roof of his mouth in terror. Who could accomplish that in which the law was powerless? Hummel. Who could drive to the uttermost ends of the earth persons against whom not a shadow of suspicion had previously rested? Hummel. Who dictated to the Chiefs of police of foreign cities what they should or should not do in certain cases, and who could, at the beckoning of his little finger, summon to his dungeon-like offices in the New York Life Building, whither his firm had removed from Center Street, the most prominent of lawyers, the most eminent of citizens, surely none but Hummel. And now Hummel was fighting for his own life. The only man that stood between him and the iron bars of Blackwell's Island was Charles F. Dodge, the man whom he had patted on the knee in his office and called a mascot, when quite in the nature of business he needed a little perjury to assist a wealthy client. Hummel in terror called into play every resource upon which, during 40 years of practice, his tiny tentacles had fastened. Who shall say that while he made a show of enjoying himself nightly with his accustomed light-heartedness in the tenderloin, he did not feel confident that in the end this peril would disappear, like the others which had from time to time threatened him during his criminal career. But Hummel was fully aware of the tenacity of the man who had resolved to rid New York of his malign influence. His nemesis was following him. In his dreams, if he ever dreamed, it probably took the shape of the square-shouldered district attorney in the shadow of whose office building the little shyster practiced his profession. Had he been told that this nemesis was in reality a jovial little man with a round, ruddy face and twinkling blue eyes, he would have laughed as heartily as it was in his power to laugh. Yet such was the fact. A little man who looked less like a detective than a commercial traveler, selling St. Peter's oil or some other cheerful concoction, with manners as gentle and a voice as soft as a spring zephyr, who always took off his hat when he came into a business office, seemingly bashful to the point of self-effacement, was the one who snatched Charles F. Dodge from the borders of Mexico and held him in an iron grip when every influence upon which Hummel could call for aid, from crooked police officials, corrupt judges, and a gang of cutthroats under the guise of a sheriff's posse, were fighting for his release. Jesse Blocker is not employed in New York County, and for business reasons he does not wish his present address known. When he comes to New York he occasionally drops into the writer's office for a cigar and a friendly chat about old times. And as he sits there and talks so modestly and with such quiet humor about his adventures with the Texas Rangers among the cactus-studded plains of the Lone Star State, it is hard even for one who knows the truth, to realize that this man is one of the greatest of detectives, or rather one of the most capable, resourceful, adroit, and quick-wit knights of adventure who ever set forth upon a seemingly impossible errand. It is unnecessary to state just how the district attorney discovered the existence of Jesse, as we knew him. It is enough to say that on Saturday morning, July 23, 1904, he was furnished with the proper credentials and given instructions to proceed at once to New Orleans, Louisiana, and locate, if it were humanly possible to do so, Charles F. Dodge, under indictment for perjury, and potentially the chief witness against Abraham H. Hummel, on a charge of conspiracy. He was told briefly and to the point that, in spite of the official reports from the police headquarters of both New York City and New Orleans to the contrary, there was reason to believe that Dodge was living, although not registered, as a guest at the St. Charles Hotel in the latter city. A partial and inaccurate description of Dodge was given him, and he was warned to use extreme caution to prevent any knowledge of his mission from being made known. Once Dodge had been discovered, he was to keep him under surveillance and wire New York immediately. Accordingly, Jesse left the city upon the same day at 4:45 p.m. and arrived 2 days later, at 9:15 on Monday morning, at New Orleans, where he went directly to the St. Charles Hotel, registered, and was assigned to room number 547 on the 5th floor. Somewhere in the hotel Dodge was secreted. The question was how to find him. For an hour Jesse sat in the hotel foyer and meditatively watched the visitors come and go, but saw no sign of his quarry. Then he arose, put on his hat and hunted out a stationery store where for 2 cents he bought a bright red envelope. He then visited a ticket scalper's office, secured the owner's business card and wrote a note on its back to Dodge offering him cheap transportation to any point that he might desire. Armed with this he returned to the hotel, walked to the desk, glanced casually over a number of telegrams exposed in a rack and, when the clerk turned his back, placed the note, addressed to Charles F. Dodge, unobserved, upon the counter. The office was a busy one. Guests were constantly depositing their keys and receiving their mail, and, even as Jesse stood there watching developments, the clerk turned round, found the note and promptly placed it in box number 420. The very simple scheme had worked, and quite unconsciously the clerk had indicated the number of the room occupied by Dodge. Jesse lost no time in ascending to the 4th floor, viewed room number 420. Returned to the desk, told the clerk that he was dissatisfied with the room assigned him, and requested that he be given either room number 421, 423, or 425, one of which he stated that he had occupied on a previous visit. After some discussion the clerk allotted him room number 423, which was almost directly opposite that occupied by Dodge, and the detective at once took up his task of watching for the fugitive to appear. Within the hour the door opened and Dodge and a companion, who subsequently proved to be E.M. Bracken, alias Bradley, an agent employed by Howe and Hummel, left the room, went to the elevator and descended to the dining room upon the 2nd floor. Jesse watched until they were safely ensconced at breakfast and then returned to the 4th floor where he tipped the chambermaid, told her that he had left his key at the office and induced her to unlock the door of room number 420, which she did under the supposition that Jesse was the person who had left the chamber in Dodge's company. The contents of the room convinced Jesse that he had found Dodge, for he discovered there 2 grips bearing Dodge's name as well as several letters on the table addressed to him. The detective returned to the hall and had a little talk with the maid. "The old gentleman with you has been quite sick," she said. "How is he today?" "He is some better," answered Jesse. "Yes, he does look better today," she added, "but he surely was powerful sick yesterday. Why, he hasn't been out of his room before for 5 or 6 days." This statement was corroborated by Dodge's physical appearance, for he looked haggard and worn. Jesse was now confident that he had found Dodge, in spite of the reports of the New Orleans police to the contrary, and he was also reasonably sure that the fugitive was too sick to leave the hotel immediately. He therefore telegraphed his superiors that he had discovered Dodge and that the latter was ill at the St. Charles Hotel. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon Jesse received a wire from New York as follows: New Orleans Police Department claims party not there. Left for Mexico 3 weeks ago. Ascertain correct destination and wire at once. Jesse at once replied. No question as to identity and presence here at this time. He now took up the task of keeping his quarry under absolute surveillance day and night, which duty from that moment he continued for a period of nearly 10 months. During the remainder of the afternoon and throughout the night Dodge and Bracken remained in room number 420, and during the evening were visited by several strangers, including a plainclothes officer from the New Orleans Police Headquarters. Little Hummel, dining in Longacre Square in the glare of Broadway, was pressing some invisible button that transmitted the power of his influence even to the police government of a city 2,000 miles away. The following day, January 26th, at about 8:40 in the morning, Dodge and Bracken descended to the lobby. Bracken departed from the hotel, leaving Dodge to pay the bill at the cashier's window, and Jesse heard him order a cab for the 11:30 a.m. Sunset Limited on the Southern Pacific Railroad and direct that his baggage be removed from his room. Jesse did the same. In the meantime, Bracken returned and promptly at 11 a.m. left for the railroad station in a cab with Dodge. Jesse followed in another. As the two passed through the gates, the detective caught a glimpse of Dodge's ticket and saw that it had been issued by the Mexican National Railway. Retiring to the telegraph office in the station, he wired New York as follows: Bird flying Sunset Limited. Destination not known. I am with him. He then hastily purchased a ticket to Houston, Texas, and boarded the train. Dodge's companion had bidden him goodbye as the engine started, and Jesse's task now became that of ferreting out Dodge's destination. After some difficulty, he managed to get a glimpse of the whole of the fugitive's ticket and thus discovered that he was on his way to the city of Mexico, via Eagle Pass, Texas. While from the Pullman conductor he learned that Dodge had secured sleeping car accommodation as far as San Antonio, Texas, only. So far all was well. He knew Dodge, but Dodge did not know him, and later on in the afternoon he had the satisfaction of a long talk with his quarry in the observation car, where they amiably discussed together current events and argued politics with the same vehemence as if they had been commercial travelers, thrown fortuitously into each other's company. Dodge, however, cleverly evaded any reference to his destination. When the train reached Morgan City, Louisiana, at 3 p.m., which was the first stop, Jesse wired New York as follows: On Sunset Limited with friend. He has transportation to the city of Mexico, via Eagle Pass, where I am now journeying with him. Answer to Beaumont, Texas. Later in the afternoon he sent an additional message from Lafayette, Louisiana. Have seen transportation of friend and am positive of destination. Dodge was occupying Section 3 of the sleeping car Capitola, and, as became an invalid, retired early. At Beaumont, Jesse failed to receive any reply to his various messages, and when the train arrived at Houston, no word came from New York until it was almost the time of departure. Waiting until practically the last moment, Jesse hurried through the gates of the Union Station at Houston and bought a ticket to San Antonio. As he was leaving the ticket window, Night Chief of Police John Howard and two officers came hurrying up, inquiring anxiously for Mr. Jesse. The reinforcements had arrived. Outside on the track, the Sunset Limited was just getting underway. The first frantic puffs were being vomited from the funnel. Inside, Dodge was sleeping peacefully in his berth. Jesse, accompanied by Chief Howard, hurried up to the conductor, who was about to swing onto the steps of the sleeper, and ordered him to hold the train till the fugitive could be removed. After some argument, the conductor grumblingly complied, and Dodge was aroused from pleasant dreams of the Creole Quarter to the cold reality of being dragged out of bed by a policeman. He was unceremoniously hustled out of the sleeping car into a carriage and taken to headquarters, where he admitted his identity and remarked, "I know what I am wanted for, but I will never return to New York." In his grip was found the sum of $1,563.15, as well as numerous letters from the law firm of Howe and Hummel and a quantity of newspaper clippings relative to his case. Dodge pleaded with Chief Howard not to lock him up, urging that he was a sick man and offering a goodly sum if he might be taken to a hotel and guarded for the remainder of the night. But what went in New Orleans, did not go in Houston, and the best that Dodge could get for himself was a cot in the ladies' detention room on the second floor of the jail. Early the following morning Jesse visited police headquarters and for the first time met George Ellis, Chief of Police of Houston, for whom he will always have a feeling of deep gratitude for his enthusiastic cooperation and loyalty in the many stirring events that followed. Dodge now received a telegram from New York, which was submitted to Jesse before reaching the prisoner, to the effect that Howe and Hummel were sending on an attorney to aid the fugitive in resisting extradition, and informing him that they had employed Messrs. Hunt and Myers as attorneys to look out for his welfare. These last immediately jumped in medias residential and on the afternoon of the same day secured a writ of habeas corpus from Norman J. Cottrell, District Judge of Harris County, Texas. Returnable the following morning. The next day, January 28, Cottrell released Dodge from custody. Jesse had anticipated this and immediately swore out another warrant with the result that the prisoner was rearrested before he left the courtroom. Meantime the Dodge interests retained another firm of lawyers, Messrs. Andrews and Ball, who, on the following day, secured a second writ of habeas corpus from Judge Ash. The result of the first engagement thus being a draw, counsel on both sides agreed that this writ should not be returnable for 6 days. During this period, District Attorney Jerome employed Messrs. Baker Botts, Parker, and Garwood to represent him and secured from Governor Odell at Albany a requisition on Governor Lanham of Texas for the extradition of the prisoner, which he entrusted to Detective Sergeant Herlihy of the New York Police. Herlihy reached Houston with the papers on the evening of January 30, and on the same train with him came Abraham Koffenberg, a member of the law firm of Howe and Hummel and a nephew of the latter. Likewise also came Bracken, still styling himself E. M. Bradley, and from now on Bracken was the inseparable companion, guide, philosopher, and friend of the unfortunate Dodge, whose continued existence upon this earth had become such a menace to the little lawyer in New York. Herlihy, accompanied by Judge Garwood, proceeded direct to Austin, where they found Dodge already represented by Messrs. Andrews and Ball, who, at the hearing before Governor Lanham, made a strong effort to induce that executive to refuse to honor the requisition of the Governor of New York. This effort failed, and Governor Lanham issued his warrant, but Herlihy had no sooner returned to Houston for the purpose of taking possession of the prisoner than he was served with an injunction enjoining him, together with Chief of Police Ellis, from taking Dodge into custody, pending a hearing upon a new habeas corpus which had been issued by Judge Waller T. Burns of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas. This new writ was returnable February 9. After exhaustive but futile argument by the counsel for Dodge, Judge Burns remanded the prisoner to Herlihy's custody to be returned to the state of New York, but this decision had no sooner been rendered than an appeal was taken therefrom by Dodge's lawyers, and the prisoner released upon bail fixed at $20,000. During this period Dodge was quartered under guard at the Rice Hotel in Houston, and the day following the argument the $20,000 bail was put up in cash and Dodge released from custody. In the meantime, however, Jesse, knowing that no sum, however large, would deter Hummel from spiriting Dodge out of the country, had made his arrangements to secure a new extradition warrant from the Governor of Texas, so that if the prisoner did succeed in getting beyond the Southern District of the Federal Court of Texas, he could be seized and conveyed to New York. Of course someone had to keep watch over Dodge while Jesse hurried to Austin to see the governor, and it was decided to leave Sergeant Herlihy, reinforced by a number of local detectives for that purpose. but while the watchful Jesse was away, Bracken proceeded to get busy in the good old how and Hummel fashion. Lots of people that Hurley had never seen before turned up and protested that he was the finest fellow they had ever met. And as Hurley was, in fact, a good fellow, he made them welcome and dined and wined at their expense. Until he woke up in the Menger Hotel in San Antonio and inquired where he was. Jesse meantime had returned from Austin to discover that Dodge with his companions, Kaufenberg and Bracken, had slipped out of Houston early in the morning of February 11th, after disposing of Hurley and eluding the watchfulness of Hurley's assistants. Hummel was leading, and by 10 o'clock the next morning Dodge and his comrades were on board an English merchantman lying in the harbor of Galveston. Later in the same day the Hummel interests chartered from the Southern Pacific Railroad for the sum of $3,000 the sea-going tug Hughes, to which Dodge was now transferred for the purpose of being conveyed to the port of Tampico in the Republic of Mexico. But here Hummel's wires became crossed with Jerome's, and unfortunately for the little lawyer, the persons from whom the tug had been leased turned out to be closely allied with the prosecution's interests, with the result that the captain of the tug was instructed by his superiors under no consideration to put into any Mexican port, but on the contrary, to delay his departure from the harbor of Galveston for a period of 2 days and then to proceed only as far as Brownsville, Texas, where he should compel the debarkation of the fugitive. The captain, who was a good sport as well as a good officer, promptly threw himself into the part and told Bracken and Kaufenberg that it was evident from the barometer that a severe storm was approaching, which must have had a sinister implication to these two unfortunate gentlemen, and that he could not think of putting to sea. Once the storm had blown over, the tug started out across the blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico. But now Bracken and Kaufenberg were informed for the first time that it was impossible to consider putting into any port of the Republic of Mexico, since to do so would cause international complications and compel the revocation of the captain's license. In desperation, the Hummel interests offered the captain $5,000 in cash to disregard his instructions and put into Tampico, but the worthy sea dog was adamant. It was probably worth $5,000 to him to see 3 gentry of this pattern so much put about. While Dodge and his accomplices were dallying in the harbor of Galveston, Jesse was taking advantage of his opportunity to proceed at once by railroad to Alice, Texas, which at that time was the furthermost southern point reached by any railway in the direction of Brownsville. On his arrival, he at once applied to Captain John R. Hughes, commanding Company D of the Texas Rangers, who received him with great joy and ordered a detachment of the Rangers to meet the tug at Point Isabella at the mouth of the Rio Grande River on the border of Mexico. In the meantime, Jesse started on a toilsome stage journey to Brownsville, across 170 miles of desert, which occupied 2 days and nights, and necessitated his going without sleep for that period. During the trip Jesse heard no word of English and had as his associates only Mexican cattlemen. Every 15 miles a fresh relay of broncos was hitched to the stage, and after a few moments' rest the misery began again. Jesse had been hurrying toward Brownsville by stage while Dodge, Kaufenberg, and Bracken were landing at Point Isabella, where they were kept under close surveillance by Sergeant Tom Ross of the Rangers. Thence they took the train to Brownsville, registering at the Miller House under the assumed names of C.F. Doherty, A. Kuntzman and E.M. Barker, all of Oklahoma. But, although they knew it not, Sergeant Tom was at their elbow, and had Dodge attempted to cross the border into Mexico he would instantly have been placed under arrest. As Brownsville was within the southern district of the Federal Court of Texas, Jesse decided not to arrest Dodge until he should actually attempt flight, and when Dodge and his companions, on the following morning, February 15th, entered the stage, the same upon which Jesse had arrived, and started for Alice, Jesse and Tom Ross procured the best horses they could find and started after them, keeping just inside of the stage. Dodge's intention in making this move was to take the Mexican International Railway at Alice and cross over to Mexico via Laredo. Jesse and Ross covered the 74 miles from Brownsville to Santa La Cruz Ranch by 4 in the afternoon, which was fairly strenuous work for a New York detective, and here found themselves so sore and exhausted from their ride that they were glad to hire a pair of horses and buggy with which to complete the journey to Alice. Luckily they were able to get into telephonic communication with various ranch owners along the road and arrange to have fresh relays of horses supplied to them every 20 miles, and here also Jesse called up Captain Hughes at Alice, and suggested that he substitute for the regular night clerk at the city hotel one of the privates of the Rangers by the name of Herod. Dodge and his companions arrived in Alice on February 17th, and, as Jesse had anticipated, repaired at once to the city hotel, where, inasmuch as they were dry from the dust of their trip and depressed by lack of society, they entered at once into an enthusiastic and confidential friendship with the man behind the counter in the hotel office, sublimely ignorant that they were unfolding to a member of the Texas Rangers all their most secret intentions. Herod was just as glad to see Dodge as Dodge apparently was to see Herod, and kindly offered to assist the fugitive to get into Mexico in any way that the latter desired. Dodge, for his part, took advantage of his usefulness to the extent of requesting him to purchase them railroad tickets, the plan being to leave Alice the following morning for Monterrey, Mexico. 3 hours after the stage bearing Dodge and his party pulled up at the city hotel, Tom Ross and Jesse drove in behind a pair of fagged-out Broncos at 2 in the morning. Jesse had had no sleep of any sort and no proper nourishment for 5 days, and had just strength enough left to drag himself up one flight of stairs and tumble into bed, from which he did not emerge for many hours. In the meantime day broke and Dodge, Koffenberg, and Bracken, having breakfasted, drove comfortably down to the International Railway Station and settled themselves in the smoker, but they had no sooner given this direct evidence of their intention before Captain Hughes entered and placed Dodge under arrest. The latter's surprise may be appreciated when it is stated that from the time the three had left Houston, they had no idea that they were being followed and believed that they had completely foiled Jesse and his assistants. While Jesse had been chasing Dodge across the desert, his lawyers had not been idle and had secured at Austin another extradition warrant from Governor Lanham, who, on receiving news of the arrest, promptly instructed Captain Hughes by wire to assume charge of the prisoner and to deliver him into the hands of the New York officer to be conveyed to New York. There now began such a legal battle as the state of Texas had never known. Hummel had been forced into his last ditch and was fighting desperately for life. Through Koffenberg he at once applied for a new writ of habeas corpus in Nueces County and engaged counsel at Corpus Christi to assist in fighting for the release of the prisoner. Precisely as Hummel had intended, Chief Fright of Nueces rode into Alice and demanded the prisoner from Captain Hughes. As Hummel had not intended, Captain Hughes refused to surrender the prisoner and told Chief Fright to go to well. He told him that he intended to obey his commander-in-chief, the governor of Texas. On February 20th, Hummel, through Koffenberg, attempted to get another writ of habeas corpus in B County, and promptly the B chief came buzzing over and demanded Dodge, but to him Hughes replied even as he had spoken to Wright. Excitement in Alice had now reached such a pitch that Judge Burns, of the federal court, in Houston, ordered United States Marshal John W. Vann, of Alice, to assume charge of the prisoner. The indomitable Hughes, however, paid no more attention to the United States Marshal than he had to the local chiefs. But the situation was so delicate and the clash of authority might so easily have resulted in bloodshed that it was finally agreed by all parties that the best thing to do was to have the prisoner returned to Houston in the joint custody of Captain Hughes of the Rangers and the United States Marshal. Jesse, through his counsel, in proper course made application to forfeit Dodge's bond and remand him to jail, but the Hummel attorneys finally induced the court, on the plea that to confine Dodge in jail would be detrimental to his already badly impaired health, to permit the prisoner to go free on a greatly increased bond, nevertheless restricting his movements to Harris County, Texas. While Jesse had fought a winning battle up to this point, he was at the end of his resources so far as the extradition of the prisoner was concerned, for Dodge was now at liberty, pending the decisions upon the habeas corpus proceedings of the United States Circuit Court of Appeals at Fort Worth, and the United States Supreme Court at Washington. But his orders were to bring Dodge back to New York. Hence, with the aid of some new men sent him from the north, he commenced an even closer surveillance of the prisoner than ever before by both day and night. Meantime Koffenberg departed for New York, fleeing from the wrath of Judge Burns, who had issued a summons for him for contempt of the federal court on the ground that he had induced Dodge to attempt to jump his bond. In place of the blustering Koffenberg was sent another member of the famous law firm of Howe and Hummel, David May, an entirely different type of man. May was as mild as a day in June, as urbane as Koffenberg had been insolent. He fluttered into Houston like a white dove of peace with the proverbial olive branch in his mouth. From now on the tactics employed by the representatives of Hummel were conciliatory in the extreme. Mr. May, however, did not long remain in Houston, as it was apparent that there was nothing to be done by either side. Pending the action of the courts, and in any event Dodge was abundantly supplied with local counsel. The time had now come when Hummel must have begun to feel that the fates were against him and that a 20-year term in state prison was a concrete possibility even for him. In the meantime, Dodge and Bracken had taken up their headquarters at the Rice Hotel in the most expensive suite of rooms in the house, a new scheme for getting the prisoner beyond the reach of the New York courts apparently having been concocted. Dodge was now indulged in every conceivable luxury and vice. He was plunged into every sort of excess. There was no debauchery which Bracken could supply that was not his, and their rapid method of existence was soon the talk of the county and continued to be so for 10 long months. There is more than one way to kill a cat and more than one method of wiping out the only existing witness against a desperate man striving to escape the consequences of crime. Dodge's daily routine was somewhat as follows: he never slept at his own hotel, but arose in the morning between 10 and 11 o'clock, when he was at once visited by Bracken and supplied with numerous drinks in lieu of the breakfast for which he never had any desire. At noon the two would have luncheon with more drinks. In the afternoon they would retire to the pool rooms and play the races. And, when the races were over, they would then visit the faro banks and gamble until midnight or later. Later on they would proceed to another resort on Louisiana Street where Dodge really lived. Here his day may be said to have begun, and here he spent most of his money, frequently paying out as much as $50 a night for wine and invariably ending in a beastly state of intoxication. It is quite probable that never in the history of debauchery has any one man ever been so indulged in excesses of every sort for the same period of Time as Dodge was during the summer and fall of 1904. The fugitive never placed his foot on Mother Earth. If they were going only a block, Bracken called for a cab, and the two seemed to take a special delight in making Jesse, as Jerome's representative, spend as much money in cab hire as possible. The Houston Jews never again experienced so profitable a time as they did during Dodge's wet season, and the life of dissipation was continued until, from time to time, the prisoner became so weak from its effects that he was forced to go under the care of a physician. A few days of abstinence always restored his vitality, and he would then start out upon another round of pleasure. During this period Jesse maintained a close and vigilant personal espionage over the prisoner. For over 10 months he slept less than 4 hours each day, his fatigue being increased by the constant apprehension of treachery among his own men, and the necessity of being ever on the alert to prevent some move on the part of the defense to spirit the prisoner away. During the summer attempts were repeatedly made to evade the vigilance of Jesse and his men, and several desperate dashes were frustrated by them, including one occasion when Bracken succeeded in rushing Dodge as far as Galveston, where they were forced to abandon their design. From time to time Bracken would disappear from Houston for a week or 10 days, stating on his return that he had been to New York, after which there was invariably some new move to get the prisoner away. Time and Space Prevent, giving a detailed account of all the marches and counter-marches that took place in this battle of wit against wit. In August 1904, Bracken made one of his periodical visits to New York, and when he returned sought out Jesse and said, "Blocker, you might as well be a good fellow and get yours while you can. I mean that Dodge is not going back to New York, even if it cost $1 million to prevent it." A few days later, Bracken sent a gambler named Warner to Jesse, who offered the latter $3,500 to get lost long enough for the prisoner to slip over to Mexico. Acting upon the advice of his attorney, Jesse encouraged this attempt, under the belief that if he could get the Hummel forces in the position of having attempted to bribe him, the prisoner's bail could then be forfeited and Dodge himself taken into custody. Hummel became wary, however, and apparently abandoned for the time the idea of bribery. Later on Bracken again disappeared. On his return a marked change was noticeable in his demeanor, and Jesse observed that he was in constant consultation with Dodge, from which the detective drew the inference that some last desperate move was to be made towards the escape of the prisoner. On one occasion Jesse saw Bracken showing Dodge a map and some drawings on paper, which so excited his suspicions that he followed the two with unremitting assiduity, and within a day or two was rewarded through Bracken's carelessness with an opportunity for going through the latter's coat pockets in the billiard room. Here he found a complete set of plans worked out in every detail for spiriting the prisoner from San Antonio into Mexico during the state fair. These plans were very elaborate, every item having been planned out from the purchase of tickets, and passing of baggage through the customs, to hotel accommodation in the city of Mexico and Tampico, and steamship tickets from Tampico to Europe. The plan had been to secure permission from the court for Dodge to leave Houston long enough ostensibly to attend the fair at San Antonio and to lose him during the excitement and crowded condition of the city at that time. It is, of course, needless to say that these plans were abandoned when Bracken discovered that Jesse had been forewarned. Almost immediately thereafter the Circuit Court of Appeals at Fort Worth, Texas, decided one of the habeas corpus cases adversely to Dodge, but it still permitted him to retain his liberty pending the final determination of the questions involved by the Supreme Court at Washington. The Hummel forces were apparently losing hope, however, for early in October Another attempt was made to bribe Jesse. Bracken entered his room one evening and informed him that he could get his own price if he would only be a good fellow, and even went so far as to exhibit a quantity of money which he stated was $25,000. The only result of this offer was to lead Jesse to redouble his precautions, for he argued that the situation must indeed be acute when such an offer could be deemed worthwhile. Thereafter it was obvious that the revelry of Dodge and his companions was on the increase. Accordingly, Jesse added to his force of assistants. On December 2, 1904, Nathaniel Cohen, another member of the firm of Howe and Hummel, arrived at Houston, and the next day the Supreme Court at Washington decided the appeal in the habeas corpus against the prisoner, who was at once ordered by Judge Burns into the custody of United States Marshal William M. Hanson. Things looked black indeed for Dodge and blacker still for Hummel. How the little attorney, eating his midday lunch 4,000 miles away, at Ponton's restaurant on Franklin Street, must have trembled in his patent leather boots. His last emissary, Cohen, at once procured an assistant by the name of Brookman, and with him proceeded to Wharton County, Texas, where they secured a new writ of habeas corpus and induced the local sheriff, one Rich, to swear in a posse comitatus of 100 men for the purpose of coming to Houston to take the prisoner by force of arms out of the hands of the United States Marshal. This was one of the most daring and desperate attempts made in recent years to frustrate the law. Jesse believes that the real object of this posse was to precipitate a fight between themselves and the federal authorities. It is not inconceivable that in such an event Dodge might either have escaped or been killed. The men composing the posse were of the most desperate character, and consisted largely of the so-called feud factions of Wharton County, known as the Woodpeckers and the Jaybirds. Jesse has been informed, on what he regards as reliable authority, that this move cost the Hummel forces $15,000 and that each member of the posse received $100 for his contemplated services in the rescue of the prisoner. But civil war, even on a small scale, cannot be indulged in without some inkling of the facts becoming known to the authorities, and prior to the receipt of the mandate of the Supreme Court, Judge Burns ordered the prisoner removed to Galveston for safe keeping. Thus the long, expensive, and arduous struggle came finally to an end, for Judge Burns in due course ordered that Charles F. Dodge should be conveyed to New York in the personal custody of the United States Marshal and delivered by him to the New York authorities within the borders of that state. Such an order was, of course, exceedingly unusual, if not almost unheard of, but it was rendered absolutely necessary by the powerful influence and resources, as well as the unscrupulous character, of those interested in securing Dodge's disappearance. In order to thwart any plans for releasing the prisoner by violence or otherwise, and to prevent delay through the invoking of legal technicalities, Hanson and Jesse decided to convey Dodge to New York by water, and on the 16th of December, the Marshal and his 5 deputies boarded a Mallory Line steamer at Galveston and arrived in New York with their prisoner on the evening of December 23d. Dodge reached New York a physical wreck. How he was induced to tell the whole truth after he had pleaded guilty to the charge against him is a story in itself. A complete reaction from his dissipation now occurred, and for days his life was despaired of. Jesse, too, was, as the expression is, all in, and the only persons who were still able to appreciate the delights of New York were the stalwart Marshal and his boys, who for some time were objects of interest as they strolled along Broadway and drank deep and hearty in the cafes. To the assistants in the district attorney's office they were heroes and were treated as such. How Dodge finally testified against Hummel on the witness stand has already been told. As they say downtown, if Jerome had never done anything else, he would have made good by locking up Abe Hummel. No one ever believed he would do it. But Jerome never would have locked up Hummel without Jesse. And, as Jesse says with a laugh, leaning back in his chair and taking a long pull on his cigar, I guess I would not do it again. No, I would not do it again for all the money you could give me. The wonder is that I came out of it alive. When the reader comes to think about it, he will probably agree with him. Story 3. Echoes in the Tunnel. The entrance shouldn't have existed. That's what struck me first when we found the rusted maintenance door behind the old subway station, its hinges screaming as we forced it open. The city maps showed nothing but solid earth beyond this point. Yet before us stretched a tunnel, narrow, damp, and stretching into perfect blackness. My flashlight beam caught the writing first. Turn back scratched into the concrete wall in jagged letters. Beneath it, newer graffiti, he's still down here. We followed the tunnel for nearly a mile before finding the first camp. A nest of blankets, empty food tins dated from the 90s, a stack of newspapers yellowed with age. The headlines told a story. Local man sought in arson case, 2003. Bank robbery suspect evades capture, 2011. Police search for missing patient, 2017. All unsolved. All from different decades. All describing different men. Then we found the wall. 50 feet of tunnel covered in newspaper clippings, mugshots, and handwritten notes connected by a web of string. At the center, a single Polaroid of a smiling man in a hospital gown, dated 1985. The edges were worn from handling. That's when we heard the scraping. Something moving in the dark ahead of us. Not running. Not hiding. Just waiting. My light caught the glint of eyes before the tunnel went black. The last thing I saw was the Polaroid, now pinned beneath a knife to the center of the wall. Fresh blood dripped from the blade. Journal entry recovered from tunnel entrance, pages damp with what testing confirmed was 17-year-old rainwater. Story 4. The Identity Swapper. Chapter 1, The Arrest That Didn't Add Up. Detective Sarah Chen knew something was wrong the moment they brought him in. The suspect John Mercer, according to his driver's license, had been caught shoplifting a $12 bottle of bourbon from a liquor store in downtown Seattle. A petty crime, barely worth processing. But when Chen ran his prints, the system lit up like a Christmas tree. Either this is the worst identity thief in history, the tech analyst said, or this guy has been officially recognized as 6 different people. The man in the interrogation room didn't look like a criminal mastermind. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, calloused hands. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Chen slid a folder across the table. Inside were 6 mugshots, all of him under different names. John Mercer. David Kessler. Marcus Rourke. Elias Voigt. Daniel Shaw. Andrei Petrov. Different nationalities. Different backgrounds. All legally documented. Chen leaned forward. Who the hell are you? The man smiled faintly. Depends on who's asking. Chapter 2, The Paper Trail to Nowhere. The deeper Chen dug, the stranger it got. John Mercer had a social security number, tax records, even a dental plan. He'd lived in Seattle for 5 years. David Kessler had died in a car crash in Germany in 2008. Except now he was sitting in Chen's interrogation room. Marcus Rourke was a British citizen with a passport stamp showing he'd entered the US 3 weeks ago. Andrei Petrov had been flagged by Interpol not for crimes, but because he kept appearing in conflict zones, always as a different person. The man never lied about his name. Each identity was legally real. But none of them were him. Chapter 3, The First Clue. Then Chen found the photo. Tucked in the back of his wallet was a faded Polaroid of a woman and a little girl, standing in front of a diner in rural Ohio. The man's face went pale when Chen held it up. For the first time, his calm cracked. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. Chen flipped it over. Scribbled on the back. "Don't let them find us." Chapter 4, The Truth Comes Out. That night, the man finally talked. His real name was Daniel Hargrove. In 2003, he'd been a systems analyst for a private military contractor. He'd stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, a black ops project that didn't exist on paper. They called it Project Lazarus, he said. A way to erase people. Not just kill them. Unmake them. Make it so they never existed. He'd tried to expose it. That's when they came for his family. His wife and daughter vanished. No records. No traces. Just, gone. So he ran. And he learned to become someone new over and over again. Chapter 5, The Disappearance. The next morning, Chen arrived at the precinct to find his cell empty. No broken locks. No alarms. Just a note on the desk. "You'll know when to look for me." And a single key taped to the back of the Polaroid. Epilogue, the key to the truth. A year later, Chen received a postcard. No return address. Just a photo of that same diner in Ohio. She took the key and went there. Inside, buried under the floorboards, she found a hard drive. And on it every name Project Lazarus had ever erased. Including Daniel Hargrove's daughter. Still alive. Still hiding. Waiting for someone to bring her home. Story 5. The Cipher Journal. The leather-bound journal arrived at Blackwood Public Library on a rainy Tuesday, tucked between a moldering copy of Great Expectations and a 1958 church cookbook stained with decades of gravy spills. Retired librarian Martha Cole nearly missed it. The spine bore no title, just a series of odd symbols burned into the leather like a brand. When she flipped it open, her breath caught. Every page was filled with a strange cipher, numbers mixed with musical notation and symbols that looked like alchemical signs. The last page held the only legible words scrawled hastily in plain English as if the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. "If you're reading this, they never found my body." Martha had spent 40 years cataloging rare books, and the thrill of a mystery sent her straight to her late husband's cryptology manuals. 3 sleepless nights later, she cracked the code, a modified Vigenerous cipher with a musical key. The journal belonged to Professor Oliver Ward, a local historian who had vanished without a trace in 1982 after giving a controversial lecture about Blackwood's founding families. His decoded entries read like a descent into madness. April 12, 1982, the Holloway family ledger confirms it. 3 bodies sealed in the chapel foundation. The mason's invoice lists lime mixture for structural integrity, but the stains never came out of his boots. Asterisk May 3, 1982, found the photographs in the attic. The children weren't runaways. The families were paid. The rest dissolved into frantic scribbles. The more Martha decoded, the clearer the pattern became. Between 1937 and 1939, 3 children from impoverished families disappeared from Blackwood, officially labeled runaways, though no searches were conducted. Each family received sudden, unexplained financial windfalls months later. The journal connected them all to the town's powerful Holloway family and their now abandoned Stonehaven Chapel. Curiosity led Martha to the chapel at dusk. The place had been condemned since 1990, the official report citing structural instability. The journal suggested a darker reason. Inside, her flashlight revealed peeling frescoes of angels with hollowed-out eyes and a section of floor near the altar that looked suspiciously newer than the rest. When she tapped it, the concrete echoed hollow. That's when she noticed the dates carved into the wall: 1937, 1938, 1939, each beside a small, rusted hook. One still held a scrap of faded blue fabric. Her hands shook as she flipped to the journal's final decoded page, a list of names. Eleanor Riggs, age 12, last seen carrying a blue dress to the river. Thomas Vale, age 9, last seen chasing a dog near the mill. Lillian Moss, age 14, last seen walking to piano lessons. Beneath the names, a single line. The Holloways always honor their bargains. A floorboard creaked behind her. Martha's flashlight beam swung wildly, catching the edge of a work boot clean, as if someone had recently polished it. The air smelled suddenly of old books and wet earth. She understood then why Oliver Ward had really used the cipher. It wasn't to hide the truth. It was to ensure only the curious would follow the trail. Because some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. They're meant to be found by the right person. At the right time. 3 days later, the Stonehaven chapel collapsed without warning. When crews cleared the rubble, they found no bodies, just a rusted lockbox containing 3 gold coins dated 1937, 1938, and 1939. Martha Cole was seen leaving town that same morning, her car packed with boxes. Neighbors later reported she'd donated her entire personal library to the very same book bin where she'd found the journal. The cipher book was among them now, with one new entry in the back, written in an unfamiliar hand. The walls are listening. Story 6. The Disappearing Banker. The morning Jonathan Voss vanished, his assistant found 3 strange things on his desk. A half-drunk cup of coffee, still warm. An open ledger with a single line circled in red, Project Lazarus, Final Transfer. A vintage pocket watch, its hands frozen at 3:17. Security footage showed the 54-year-old banking executive entering his 42nd floor office at 8:47 a.m. It never showed him leaving. Part 1, The Ghost Accounts. Financial investigator Lena Torres had been building the fraud case against Voss International for 9 months. The numbers didn't make sense. $2.3 billion moved through shadow accounts linked to no known client. The money always followed the same path. Zurich rightward arrow, Cayman's rightward arrow, a series of numbered accounts rightward arrow, nowhere. The night before Voss disappeared, Lena had finally cracked it. The transfers weren't random. They formed coordinates. 33.4158 degrees north, 104.5286 degrees west. Middle of the New Mexico desert. Part 2, The Empty House. The coordinates led to a derelict ranch house with no electricity, no plumbing, just a basement lined with 1970s computer equipment. The monitors still glowed, displaying a single line of text. Waiting for final authorization. On the desk. A faded photo of Voss shaking hands with 3 men in military uniforms, none existed in Pentagon records. A ledger matching the one from his office. A landline phone with the receiver off the hook. Lena picked it up. A mechanical voice recited, "Account 007 activated. Lazarus protocol complete." Then the line went dead. Part 3, The Watch. Forensics found something strange about Voss's abandoned pocket watch. The casing was warm to the touch, even in ice. X-rays revealed microcircuits inside, far more advanced than modern tech. When placed near the ranch computers, the hands moved backward. The watchmaker's mark led to a Zurich company that didn't exist. The serial number matched a watch reported lost in 1952 by a banker who vanished during the Marshall Plan. Part 4, The Last Transfer. Lena traced the final Lazarus transfer to a Swiss vault. Inside box 707. A stack of bearer bonds from 1947. A modern USB drive containing blueprints for something called temporal anchoring apparatus. A note in Voss's handwriting. They promised it would work. That I could fix everything. But the accounts have to balance. For every dollar moved forward, someone has to be left behind. The bonds were dated the day before 3 Wall Street bankers disappeared in 1978. Epilogue. The official report listed Voss as a fugitive. The ranch house burned down mysteriously. The case was closed. But sometimes, when Lena works late, her office landline rings. No one ever speaks. Just the sound of a pocket watch ticking. And if she checks the caller ID, it always shows the same number. 007-1952. 3 weeks after the investigation ended, $2.3 billion reappeared across the original accounts with 74 years' worth of interest. The transaction timestamp: June 11, 2023. The day Jonathan Voss disappeared. Story 7. The Great Museum Heist. The security guards didn't notice anything wrong until the smell hit them. At precisely 3:17 a.m., a sharp, coppery tang flooded the climate-controlled halls of the Whitmore Museum of Antiquities. By the time the night shift reached the Egyptian wing, the scent had deepened into something organic: hot metal and wet earth, like the inside of a freshly opened tomb. The golden sarcophagus of Pharaoh Nakhmen was gone. Not stolen. Vanished. No broken glass. No disabled alarms. The laser grid showed no interruptions. Only 2 clues remained. A perfect circle of sand where the sarcophagus had stood. A single hieroglyph freshly carved into the pedestal. Ankh Life Eternal. Part 1, The Impossible Crime. Interpol investigator Elias Shaw arrived to a museum in chaos. The heist made no sense. The sarcophagus weighed 1,200 pounds. The only exit was a service elevator with a 300-pound limit. Infrared logs showed no heat signatures in the wing all night. Then the conservator found the residue. Black flakes coated the sand circle, carbon dated to 3,000 years old. The same age as Nakhmen's burial. Under a microscope, the particles showed crystalline structures unknown to modern science. Like something was unmade here, the lab tech whispered. Part 2, The Curator's Secret. Dr. Amara Khalid had warned them. The museum's Egyptology curator had filed 3 formal objections to displaying Nakhmen's sarcophagus. Her research suggested the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was a heretic priest who'd discovered a path between worlds. When Shaw searched her office, he found a 1924 expedition photo showing the sarcophagus already open. Museum records claimed it was sealed. A journal entry: the gold isn't metal, it's a skin. The real horror is inside. A plane ticket to Cairo dated the day before the heist. Dr. Khalid's apartment was empty. Her cat's water bowl still full. Her bed neatly made. On the pillow, a scarab beetle carved from the same black material as the museum residue. Part 3, The Blueprint. The museum director finally confessed. The Whitmore had never legally acquired the sarcophagus. It was stolen in 1924 by a rogue archaeologist who'd burned his entire team alive in the Valley of Kings. His last cable read: "It wakes. Ship now or destroy it." Hidden behind a false wall in the director's office, Shaw found the original excavation notes. The sarcophagus wasn't empty when discovered. The team heard knocking from inside during transport. X-rays showed no mummy, just dense black mass shaped like a crouching man. The last page held a sketch of the hieroglyph now carved at the crime scene. Beneath it, in shaky handwriting: "Not a tomb. A cage." Part 4, The Delivery. 1 week later, a package arrived at Interpol HQ. Inside, Dr. Khalid's mint-condition passport, stamped exiting Cairo airport yesterday. A 3,000-year-old linen fragment with fresh blood typing matched to the director. A museum security badge from 1924. And one final clue: a child's crayon drawing of the Egyptian wing. In the picture, the sarcophagus stood open. A shadowy figure held hands with a stick, female, labeled Dr. K, while a second figure, labeled Nakhmen, climbed out a window. The drawing was dated. Tomorrow's date. Epilogue. The Whitmore reopened with new exhibits. But late at night, guards report The scent of buried soil in the Egyptian wing. Security footage showing one extra visitor who never checks in. The faint sound of knocking coming from inside a solid granite statue. As for the hieroglyph carved at the crime scene, it changes slightly each month. Growing more complex. More alive. Last week, an intern noticed something new beneath it, tiny stick figures holding hands. Marching toward the exit. Story 8. A murder conspiracy. 4. William M. Rice, 84 years of age, died at the Berkshire Apartments at 500 Madison Avenue, New York City, at about half after 7 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, September 23, 1900. He had been ill for some time, but it was expected that he would recover. On or about the moment of his death, 2 elderly ladies, friends of the old gentleman, had called at the house with cakes and wine, to see him. The elevator man rang the bell of Mr. Rice's apartment again and again, but could elicit no response, and the ladies, much disappointed, went away. While the bell was ringing, Charles F. Jones, the confidential valet of the aged man, was waiting, he says, in an adjoining room until a cone saturated with chloroform, which he had placed over the face of his sleeping master, should affect his death. Did Jones murder Rice? If so, was it, as he claims, at the instigation of Albert T. Patrick? These two questions, now settled in the affirmative forever, so far as criminal and civil litigation are concerned, have been the subject of private study and public argument for more than 7 years. Mr. Rice was a childless widower, living the life of a recluse, attended only by Jones, who was at once his secretary, valet, and general servant. No other person lived in the apartment, and few visitors ever called there. Patrick was a New York lawyer with little practice who had never met Mr. Rice, was employed as counsel in litigation hostile to him, yet in whose favor a will purporting to be signed by Rice, June 30, 1900, turned up after the latter's death, by the terms of which Patrick came into the property, amounting to over $7 million, in place of a charitable institution named in an earlier will of 1896. It is now universally admitted that the alleged will of 1900 was a forgery, as well as 4 checks drawn to Patrick's order, 2 for $25,000 each, 1 for $65,000, and 1 for $135,000, which represented practically all of Rice's bank accounts, an order giving him control of the contents of Rice's safe deposit vaults, in which were more than $2,500,000 in securities, and also a general assignment by which he became the owner of Rice's entire estate. Thus, upon Rice's death, Patrick had every possible variety of document necessary to possess himself of the property. Jones took nothing under any of these fraudulent instruments. Hence Patrick's motive in desiring the death of Rice is the foundation stone of the case against him. But that Patrick desired and would profit by Rice's death in no way tends to establish that Rice did not die a natural death. Patrick would profit equally whether Rice died by foul means or natural, and the question as to whether murder was done must be determined from other evidence. This is only to be found in the confession of the valet Jones and in the testimony of the medical experts who performed the autopsy. Jones, a self-confessed murderer, swears that upon the advice and under the direction of Patrick, though in the latter's absence, he killed his master by administering chloroform. There is no direct corroborative evidence save that of the experts. Upon Jones's testimony depended the question of Patrick's conviction or acquittal, and of itself this was not sufficient, for being that of an accomplice it must, under the New York law, be corroborated. In the confession of Jones, the state had sufficient direct evidence of the crime, and of Patrick's connection with it, providing there was other evidence tending to connect Patrick with its commission. This corroborative evidence is largely supplied by the facts which show that for a long time Patrick conspired with Jones to steal the bulk of Mr. Rice's estate at his death. This evidence not only shows Patrick's possible motive for planning Mr. Rice's murder, but also tends to corroborate Jones's whole story of the conspiracy. Rice did not know Patrick even by sight. He had heard of him only as a person retained by another lawyer, Holt, to do the dirty work in an action brought by Rice against Holt, as executor, to set aside Mrs. Rice's will, in which she assumed, under the community law of Texas, where Rice had formerly resided, to dispose of some $2,500,000 of Rice's property. If Rice was a resident of Texas, she had the legal right to do this, otherwise not. Holt employed Patrick to get evidence that Rice still was such a resident. Rice knew of this and hated Patrick. Patrick's connection with the Rice litigation had begun 4 years before the murder, which was not planned until August 1900. His first visit to Rice's apartment was made under the assumed name of Smith for the purpose of discovering whether the valet could be corrupted into furnishing fictitious proof of Rice's intent to reside in Texas. He flattered Jones, told him he was underpaid and not appreciated, and, after a second visit, at which he disclosed his right name, persuaded him to typewrite a letter on Rice's stationery addressed to Baker, Botts, Baker and Lovett, Rice's attorneys, in which he should be made to say that he had lost hope of winning the suit against Holt, was really a citizen of Texas, and wanted to settle the litigation. Patrick said that he could arrange for the signing of such a letter and was willing to pay Jones $250 for his help. Jones agreed. Patrick now learned that Mr. Rice was living with no companion except Jones, that he held little communication with the outside world, that the valet was in his confidence and thoroughly familiar with his papers, and that the will made in 1896 disinherited natural heirs in favor of an educational institution which he had founded in Texas. He also learned that while Mr. Rice was 84 years of age, he was in possession of all his faculties, conducted his own business, and might live for years. Possessed of these facts, Patrick's evil mind soon developed a conspiracy with Jones to secure the whole estate. Mr. Rice's pet charity was the William M. Rice Institute for the Advance of Science, Art, and Literature, of Texas, which he had founded in 1891. He had donated to it more than $1.5 million by the will of 1896 only. Small legacies were bequeathed to relatives, while the bulk of his fortune was left to the Institute. About a month after Patrick's first visit to the Berkshire Apartments, that is, in December 1899, while he and Jones were examining Rice's private papers, they stumbled upon the will. Patrick saw his opportunity. By the forgery of a new will, which would increase the legacies of those mentioned in the will of 1896 and leave legacies to every person who might have any claim upon the estate, it would be for the interest of those persons to sustain and carry into effect the forgery. The whole scheme was based upon the belief that every man has his price. He told Jones that he thought the will unjust, that he did not think it right to leave so little to relatives, and later he brought to Jones a rough draft of a will, which could be substituted for the genuine one. Patrick was to get half the estate. The relatives were to receive double or 3 times the amount provided in the 1896 will, and what was left was to be given to the Rice Institute. He proposed that Jones should typewrite this will, and guaranteed to arrange for the witnessing and signing of it, and promised that Jones should get whatever he wanted. Jones at first objected, but was finally won over. Rewritten many times to include new ideas of the conspirators, the document finally reached the form of the will of June 30, 1900, in which Patrick substituted himself for the Rice Institute and made himself one of the executors. An ingenious part of the conspiracy was the decision to leave the 1896 will in existence. If Patrick had destroyed it and the relatives had succeeded in overthrowing the will of 1900, the estate would have been left without testamentary disposition and the relatives would have got more than was provided by either will. With the will of 1896 in existence, however, the relatives would get less if they overthrew the forgery. By retaining it, therefore, Patrick figured that the relatives would have selfish reasons for accepting the forgery as genuine. The preparation of this bogus will occupied about a month, and the next question was the procurement of witnesses. It was desirable to get the same persons who witnessed the former will. These were Walter H. Weatherby and W. F. Harmon, clerks for many years at Swenson's banking house. On the assumption that Weatherby had been injured by Rice and was therefore hostile to him, Jones practically unfolded the scheme. He told Weatherby that one of Mr. Rice's bonds had disappeared and that Rice had accused Weatherby of stealing it. He wound up with the suggestion, "I will get one witness and you can get another, and the thing is done." But Weatherby indignantly declined to join in the conspiracy. Morris Myers, who had been employed in Patrick's office, and David L. Short, a friend of both, were the false witnesses finally selected. They were clothed with the appearance of honesty and were brought into contact with Rice by Jones at various times, Myers as a notary public, and Short as Commissioner of Deeds for the state of Texas, an appointment procured for him by Patrick probably for this specific purpose. The date of the forged will, June 30, 1900, was selected to correspond with the date of 3 genuine papers which Rice acknowledged before Short on that date. Last page of the forged will of 1900, showing the forgery of Rice's signature and the false attestation of Short and Myers. Last page of the forged will of 1900, showing the forgery of Rice's signature and the false attestation of Short and Myers. The next step was to obviate the absurdity of Patrick's being selected as the residuary legatee at a time when he was engaged in bitter litigation against Rice. The best way out was for Patrick to pose as a lawyer who had brought about a settlement of this expensive litigation and thus won Rice's regard. Patrick first tried to accomplish this by getting friends to visit Rice and urge a settlement. But Rice rebuffed them all. Accordingly, Patrick again resorted to forgery, and in August 1900, manufactured an instrument of settlement, dated March 6, 1900. But such an agreement would not explain the paradox of a man whom Rice hated and despised and did not know by sight turning up as the principal beneficiary under his will. It was necessary to manufacture evidence to be used after Rice's death in support of his claim of close relations. The idea of a personal meeting with Rice had been abandoned on Jones's advice, and Patrick therefore caused the valet to prepare 25 or 30 forged letters addressed to him and purporting to come from Rice. These referred to current business matters and conveyed the impression that it was Rice's custom to seek the lawyer's advice. One instructed Patrick as to the terms of the will of 1900. Carbon copies were made for filing in Rice's letter book after his death, to make assurance doubly sure and to secure immediate possession of Rice's securities. A general assignment to Patrick of all Rice's estate was forged, and an order giving him access to and possession of the securities on deposit in Rice's safety vault. But Patrick did not stop here. He procured from Jones 3 checks signed by Mr. Rice in the regular course of business, one payable to Jones for his July salary and the other two for the July and August salary of an employee of Rice's in Texas named Cohn. These 3 checks Patrick kept as models, forwarding to Cohn 2 forged checks filled out by Jones upon which Rice's signature had been traced, and returning to Jones a substitute check with Rice's signature traced upon it. All 3 checks passed through the bank's unsuspected traced signatures were also substituted for genuine ones upon letters dictated by Rice to his Texas correspondents. Thus Patrick secured the circulation of 5 copies of Rice's signature which, if occasion demanded, he could produce as standards of comparison to correspond with his other forgeries. The principal preparations were complete. But title under the will might long be delayed and perhaps even eventually fail. Patrick was poor and in no condition to conduct adequately a serious litigation. The moment Mr. Rice died, a large amount of cash would be necessary. For the procurement of this, Patrick and Jones looked to the current balance of Rice's bank account, which amounted to some $250,000 on deposit at Swenson's private bank and at the Fifth Avenue Trust Company. With this they felt reasonably secure of success. For even if the will should be set aside as fraudulent, they had a second line of defense in the general assignment of the estate and the orders to Rice's $2,500,000 of securities. While the evidence affords a motive for Patrick to desire the death of Mr. Rice, it does not of itself, up to this point, indicate the slightest intention on the part of Patrick to do away with the old gentleman. It was therefore conceded by the prosecution that, upon Jones's own testimony, the conspiracy to murder was not formed until about 7 weeks before the event. The first evidence which points to an intent to murder is the famous cremation letter, dated August 3d. The cremation letter from Mr. Rice, authorizing Patrick to cremate his body, shows that Patrick intended to do away with Rice in such a way that an autopsy must, if possible, be prevented and the evidence of murder destroyed. That Patrick forged such a letter was evidence that his connection with the murder was premeditated and deliberate. To cremate the body before an autopsy, it was necessary to procure a physician's certificate that Rice had died from natural causes. He therefore made preparation to secure such a certificate, and then upon the strength of the cremation letter to give directions for the immediate destruction of the body. Patrick, with the view of having at hand a physician who would be unsuspicious, and who would issue a certificate of death from natural causes, induced Jones to send for Dr. Curry, his own friend and physician, on an occasion when the valet was ill. This was in March, 1900. Dr. Curry came, and Jones, acting under Patrick's advice, cautioned him not to mention the lawyer's name to Rice. In course of time he saw Rice, gained his good opinion and became his attending physician. But Rice did not die, and curiously enough it was he himself who suggested to Jones the instrumentality of death which was finally employed, for he read an article dealing with the dangers of chloroform as an anesthetic, and discussed it with the valet. This suggestion was conveyed to Patrick, who asked Dr. Curry whether chloroform left any traces discoverable upon an autopsy. Dr. Curry rather carelessly replied that it left but slight traces if administered only in the quantities which would be fatal to a man with a weak heart. Patrick told Jones, so Jones alleges, to procure some chloroform, and this he did, sending to Texas for 2 bottles of 2 ounces each. From Dr. Curry's remarks it was manifest that a weakened condition of the patient was an important element, and, as Jones was taking some mercury pills, prescribed for him by Dr. Curry, the valet induced his master to take some of them. The old gentleman was benefited, however, rather than weakened. This was before the forgery of the cremation letter. It was clear that larger doses of mercury would be necessary, and accordingly Patrick furnished Jones with pellets containing the drug in such quantities that Jones, experimenting with one of them, became ill. They had now the means to effect gradual death, but as mercury leaves traces discernible at an autopsy, it was decided that the body must be cremated promptly. Hence the cremation letter. It was hoped that Rice might drop off at any moment, owing to his weakened condition, and in anticipation of death. Patrick discontinued his visits to the apartment in order to establish a satisfactory alibi. Jones also frequently absented himself from the apartment in the evenings. After the old man had fallen asleep, the famous letter forged by Patrick, which requests the cremation of the remains of the supposed writer, old Mr. Rice. Last page of the forged will of 1900. Showing the forgery of Rice's signature, and the false attestation of Short and Myers. On September 16 Rice had an attack of acute indigestion, which might have resulted seriously had it not been for the mercurial pills which promptly relieved him. The reader should observe that practically all of this testimony comes from Jones. There is no extraneous evidence that Patrick induced the giving of the mercury. Patrick, however, spread false rumors as to Rice's general health and also as to his financial condition and intentions, namely, that Rice was only worth $750,000, and that those who expected he was going to leave his money to the Institute were doomed to disappointment. But neither his statements about Rice's condition nor his remarks as to the disposition and extent of his property are inconsistent with a mere hope that he would die and thus leave Patrick free to enjoy the fruits of his forgeries. There now occurred, however, an event which may well have played a part in inducing Patrick to supplement forgery by murder. On Sunday, September 16, the plant of the Merchants and Planters Oil Company of Houston, Texas, of which Rice owned 75% of the capital stock, was destroyed by fire. The company being without funds to rebuild, its directors telegraphed to Rice requesting him to advance the money. The amount needed was $250,000, and if Rice consented, all the available funds on deposit in the New York banks, upon which the conspirators relied to accomplish their object, would be exhausted. Jones endeavored to dissuade the old man from advancing the money, but without effect, and Rice sent a letter to Houston, agreeing to supply $150,000 and more in installments of $25,000 each. This was on September 18. After he had wired to the same effect on September 17, Patrick and Jones suppressed a telegram that Rice would advance $250,000, and on September 19 the old man received word that the first draft in conformity with his telegram of September 17 had been drawn and would arrive in New York on the 22d. Jones says that on showing this to Patrick, the latter announced that Rice must be put out of the way as soon as possible. Accordingly, on September 20th and 21st, Jones administered larger doses of mercury than usual, which, while weakening and depressing him, failed to cause his end. Saturday, September 22d, the draft was presented at Rice's apartment. The old man was not confined to his bed, but Jones told the bank messenger, after pretending to consult him, that Rice was too ill to attend to business that day and to return on Monday. That night Jones and Patrick met, and it was agreed according to Jones, that Rice must not be allowed to survive until Monday. They still hoped that he might die without any further act upon their part, but Jones was informed by Dr. Curry that, although the old man seemed weak and under a great mental strain, he nevertheless thought that he would recover. This Curry also told to Patrick, the latter calling at the doctor's house about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. "You think Mr. Rice will be able to go down Monday morning?" Patrick asked. "You had better wait until Monday morning comes," replied Dr. Curry. "Do you think he will be able to go downtown next week?" persisted the lawyer. The doctor answered in the affirmative. That night Mr. Rice slept quietly until 8 o'clock Sunday morning. Dr. Curry called and found him in excellent condition, having eaten a hearty breakfast. His heart was a trifle weak, but it was sound. His organs were all working normally. He felt no pain. The doctor left without prescribing any medicine, stating that he would not return unless called, and expressing his opinion that the patient would recover. This was about 11 o'clock, and Jones immediately hastened to Patrick's house and reported the conversation. It was clear that Rice's death would not occur before Monday morning. He might live to pay over the $250,000, long enough to give further testimony in the whole litigation, and thus expose the whole fraudulent scheme of pretended settlement and of friendly relations with the lawyer, and finally, perhaps, even to make a new will. The success of the conspiracy demanded that Rice should die that night. Did he die naturally? Was his death caused by any further act of the conspirators? Did Jones kill him by means of chloroform? Jones's story is that Patrick supplied him with some oxalic acid which was to be mixed with powdered ammonia and diluted in water, on the theory that it was preferable to chloroform since it would not require Jones's presence in the room. At the moment of death, Jones said that he endeavored to administer the mixture to the old man, but that he refused to take it. Jones had already procured the chloroform from Texas, as has been stated, and had turned it over to Patrick. He says that afternoon he procured this from Patrick, who told him how to administer it. This was a few moments after 6 o'clock. Rice was sleeping soundly. The colored woman who did the housework was absent for the day and the rooms were deserted. He saturated a sponge with chloroform, constructed a cone out of a towel, placed the sponge in the cone, put the cone over the sleeping man's face and ran out of the room and waited 30 minutes for the chloroform to complete the work. Waiting in the next room he heard the doorbell ring, and ring again, but he paid no attention to the summons. In point of fact he was never quite sure himself whether the bell was not the creation of his own overwrought brain. At the end of half an hour he returned to the bedroom, removed the cone from Rice's face and saw that he was dead. Then after burning the sponge and the towel in the kitchen range he opened the windows, straightened the rooms out, called the elevator man, asked him to send for Dr. Curry, and telephoned to Patrick that Rice was dead. Jones had no sooner telephoned Patrick that Rice was dead than the lawyer hastened to Dr. Curry's, and within 40 minutes appeared with him in Rice's apartments, assuming complete charge, summoning an undertaker and having the cremation letter at hand. He gave orders for speedy cremation. But he now discovered the principal mistake in his calculations. He had omitted to investigate the length of time required to heat the crematory. This he now discovered to his horror to be 24 hours. But the body must be destroyed. The undertaker suggested that the body might be embalmed while the crematory was being heated, and Patrick at once seized upon the suggestion and gave orders to that effect, although the cremation letter sets forth specifically that One of the reasons why Rice desired cremation was his horror of being embalmed. The body was embalmed at the apartments that night, Dr. Curry innocently supplying the certificate of death from old age and weak heart, and as immediate cause, indigestion followed by colorectal diarrhea with mental worry. Having arranged for the cremation at the earliest possible moment, Jones and Patrick rifled the trunk in which Rice kept his papers, and stuffed them in a satchel which Patrick bore away with him. The funeral was to be held early Tuesday morning and the ashes conveyed by Jones to Milwaukee, to be interred near the body of Rice's wife, while the relatives should not be notified until it should be too late for them to reach New York. The next step was to secure the $250,000 which Rice had on deposit. Patrick had already forged Rice's name to blank checks on Swenson and the Fifth Avenue Trust Company. Early Monday morning Jones, with Patrick looking over his shoulder and directing him, filled out the body of the checks, which covered all but $10,000 of Rice's deposits. These consisted of one for $25,000 and one for $65,000 on Swenson, one for $25,000 and another for $135,000 on the trust company. They were all made payable to the order of Patrick and dated September 22d, the day before Rice's death. One of the drafts on the Fifth Avenue Trust Company was cashed for him by a friend named Potts early Monday morning, and was paid without suspicion. But now came the second error, which resulted in the exposure of the conspiracy and conviction for murder. Jones, in filling out the $25,000 check on Swenson, had in his nervousness omitted the L from Patrick's Christian name, so that the check read Aber T. Patrick, and Patrick in his excitement had failed to notice the omission or attempt to obviate it by extra endorsement. This $25,000 Swenson check was intrusted to David L. Short for presentation to Swenson and Sons for certification. When he presented it, Wallace, the clerk, recognized Jones's handwriting in the body of it, and thought the signature looked unnatural. He took it to a rear office, where he showed it to Weatherby, who was the person whom Jones had approached 9 months before with the request that he join the conspiracy to manufacture a bogus will. Weatherby compared the signature on the check with genuine signatures in the bank, and returned it to Short without any intimation that he regarded it as irregular, but assigning as the reason the defect in the endorsement. Short thereupon returned the check to Patrick, who supplied the necessary supplementary endorsement and telephoned to Jones what had occurred, instructing him to say that the check was all right in case the Swensons should inquire. Half an hour later Short returned to Swenson's, where the check was examined by one of the firm. Rice's apartments were then called up, and Jones said that the checks were all right. But this did not satisfy Mr. Swenson, so he instructed Wallace to call up the apartment again and insist on talking to Mr. Rice. Jones delayed replying to Wallace and in the afternoon called up Patrick on the telephone, inquiring what he should say. Patrick replied that he would have to say that Rice was dead. And in accordance with this Jones informed Swenson that Rice had died at 8 o'clock the previous evening. It was thus clear to Swenson that although the maker of the check was dead, Patrick, a lawyer cognizant of that fact, was seeking to secure payment upon it. For Jones had told Swenson that he had reported Rice's death to the doctor and to Rice's lawyer. Patrick, accompanied by Potts, went immediately to the bank, where Swenson informed him that the check could be paid only to the administrator. Patrick replied that there would be no administrator, that Rice had left no property in this state, and informed Swenson that he had an assignment by Rice to himself of all Rice's securities with Swenson. He also invited Swenson to the funeral. Later in the day, Patrick attempted to obtain possession of Rice's securities in the Safety Deposit Company and in the Fifth Avenue Trust Company, by presenting forged instruments of transfer and the orders heretofore referred to, but after some delay the trust companies declined him access. The conspiracy had begun to go to pieces. The two mistakes and the failure to secure funds placed Patrick in a dangerous position. 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, 18 hours after the death, Jones, at Patrick's direction, began to notify the relatives that Rice had died the evening before, and that the funeral would take place the following morning. The telegrams to Baker and to Rice, Jr., in Texas, were in the following extraordinary form. Mr. Rice died 8 o'clock last night under care of physicians. Death certificate. Old age, weak heart, delirium. Left instructions to be interred in Milwaukee with wife. Funeral 10 a.m. tomorrow at 500 Madison Avenue. It is significant that care was used to convey the information that the death was a natural one with a physician in attendance, that the body was to be interred in Milwaukee, without reference to the cremation. This may well have been so that, if any suspicions of foul play should arise, the recipients, realizing that they could not reach New York in time to arrest matters there, might hasten to Milwaukee to intercept the body, where they could be met by Jones with the cremation letter in his pocket and his urn of ashes under his arm. But the telegram did arouse suspicion, and Baker and Rice immediately wired Jones as follows: "Please make no disposition of Rice's remains until we arrive. We leave tonight. Arrive New York Thursday morning." Baker also instructed N.A. Meldrum, a Texan then in New York, to cooperate with Jones in preserving everything intact. In the meantime, however, Swenson had notified his attorneys, who in turn had informed the police and the district attorney's office, and that evening at about 11 o'clock James W. Gerard, accompanied by a detective, who posed as the lawyer's clerk, interviewed Patrick at his home. Patrick informed Gerard that he had an assignment of all Rice's property and also a will of Rice's of which he was executor. This was the first reference to the will of 1900. He also informed Gerard that he would not receive a cent under its provision. To have explained the real terms of the will would, under the circumstances, have excited too much suspicion. Yet he was eager to let the Swensons know that as executor he was in a position to control the profitable banking business that would arise from the settlement of the estate. In the meantime, 4 headquarters detectives, representing themselves as lawyers, visited the apartments. Patrick hurried to 500 Madison Avenue, where he learned of Meldrum's presence in town. Things were turning out far from the way in which he had expected. He then hastened to his office downtown, which he reached about 1:30 in the morning, and, alone, destroyed great quantities of paper, attempting to dispose of them through the toilet bowl, which was so clogged that the water flowed out upon the floor, necessitating an apology to the janitor. In the silence of the night, misgivings came upon him. He lost his nerve, and at 2 o'clock in the morning called up the undertaker and revoked the signed order for cremation, which he had given. Leaving the office at about 5 in the morning, he first visited Myers, thence proceeded to his own boarding house, and from there went to the apartments, which he reached at 8 o'clock. Here he found the detectives who had been on guard since early morning to forestall any attempt to remove the body. At the funeral itself he attempted to conciliate adverse interests and to win witnesses for his purpose. He had begun to do this the very night that Rice had died, when he told the elevator man that he was remembered in Rice's will. He had also informed Weatherby that he had a $5,000 legacy. At the funeral were Blinn, one of Rice's nephews, who had come on from Massachusetts, and two ladies, to each of whom he stated that they had legacies, which would soon be available provided there was no contest of the will. 4 forged signatures of W. M. Rice, which bisected and rearranged haphazard, fit exactly, thus showing that they were made from the same model. This would be an utter impossibility in the case of 4 genuine signatures. 4 forged signatures of W. M. Rice, which bisected and rearranged haphazard, fit exactly, thus showing that they were made from the same model. This would be an utter impossibility in the case of 4 genuine signatures. Forged assignment of vault at the New York Safe Deposit Co. from Rice to Patrick. Forged assignment of vault at the New York Safe Deposit Co. from Rice to Patrick. The detectives now informed Patrick that he was wanted at headquarters, and Patrick invited Potts to accompany him, informing the latter that the police suspected that there was something unnatural in the cause of death, but that he could explain satisfactorily. As a matter of fact, no such intimation had been made to him by the police or anyone else. At police headquarters, after an interview with Inspector McCluskey, he was permitted to go his way. Patrick returned to Rice's apartments, sent for Short and Myers, and conferred with them there. He took this occasion to tell Maria Scott, the colored woman who worked in the apartment, that she was suspected of having poisoned Rice, and that she had better say nothing about his death. Jones told her that she was remembered in the will and that it would be worth her while to stand by himself and Patrick, who would see that she was taken care of. Meanwhile, the coroner had sent the body to the morgue for autopsy. The autopsy was performed on Tuesday, 43 hours after death occurred, by Dr. Donlin, a coroner's physician, in the presence of Dr. Williams, also a coroner's physician, and of Professor R.A. Whitthos, an expert chemist. The two physicians testified at the trial that the organs of the body, except the lungs, were normal in condition, save as affected by the embalming fluid. They and Professor Whitthos agreed in their testimony that the lungs were congested. Dr. Donlin spoke of their being congested all over, while Dr. Williams characterized it as an intense congestion of the lungs coextensive with them. Outside of the lungs they found no evidence of disease to account for death, and beyond the congestion these showed nothing except a small patch of consolidated tissue about the size of a 25-cent piece. They testified, in effect, that nothing save the inhalation of some gaseous irritant could have produced such a general congestion, and that the patch of tissue referred to was insufficient to account for the amount of congestion present. Dr. Donlin could not testify what the proximate cause of death was, but was firm in his opinion that no cause for it was observable in the other vital organs. In this Dr. Williams concurred. He was of the opinion that chloroform would act as an irritant upon the lungs and cause precisely that general congestion observable in the case of the deceased. Professor Whitthos testified that his analysis revealed the presence of mercury, obtained as calomel, and while the amount was not sufficient to cause death, its presence indicated that a larger quantity had existed in life. The embalming fluid had contained no mercury, and he and Dr. Donlin agreed that the embalming fluid would have no effect upon the lungs beyond a tendency to bleach them. In other words, the people's evidence was to the effect that no cause of death was observable from a medical examination of the body save the congestion stated to exist in the lungs, and that this might have been caused by chloroform. Thursday morning Mr. Baker and F.A. Rice, the brother of the deceased, arrived in New York. Patrick showed them the cremation letter, and, inasmuch as they took a neutral position in the matter, ordered the cremation to proceed, and accordingly it took place that very day. He also endeavored to win the confidence of Baker, but succeeded in accomplishing little. He finally gave the latter a copy of the 1900 will and the original will of 1896. He also informed Baker that he had taken a large number of papers from Rice's apartments, and turned over to him a considerable number of them. He also surrendered on Friday the 2 Swenson checks. After considerable discussion, Baker told Patrick flatly that he would never consent to the probate of the 1900 will, that he was satisfied that the 96 will was the last will of Rice, and that he would insist upon its being probated, to which Patrick replied, that so far as he was concerned he did not know, but that the probate of the 96 will would suit him just as well as the probate of the 1900 will. That it was a matter of indifference to him, and that so far as the Rice Institute was concerned he was prepared to give Baker from $3 to $5 million for it, or any other sum Baker might name. These negotiations and conferences continued until the 4th of October, Patrick yielding step by step, until he had divested himself of all control of the documents and securities. Meantime, sufficient evidence having been secured, Patrick and Jones were arrested on a charge of forgery and held for the grand jury. Bail was fixed at $10,000 each, but was not forthcoming. On October 21, Mr. House, Patrick's lawyer, visited Patrick and Jones in the Tombs. Jones says that after Patrick had talked to Mr. House, the former called Jones to one corner of the room and told him that House insisted on knowing definitely whether a crime had been committed, and directed Jones to tell House that a murder had been committed, but that he, Patrick, was not concerned in it. This Jones declined to do without implicating Patrick. The two prisoners then returned to House, and Jones says that he informed House that he had killed Rice by chloroform, and gave him the same story which he told on the witness stand. After this, Jones apparently lost his nerve and told Patrick that he intended to commit suicide. This idea Patrick encouraged, agreeing that they should both do it at about the same time. On the 26th of October, Jones made a statement to Assistant District Attorney Osborne which was in large part false, and in which he endeavored to exonerate himself entirely from complicity in any of the crimes, and in which he charged the actual administration of the chloroform to Patrick. 4 days later, Osborne sent for him and told him he had lied, upon which Jones became confused, continued to persist in some of his statements, qualified others, and withdrew still others. He was completely unnerved, and that night attempted, by means of a knife which Patrick had supplied him, to cut his throat. The attempt was a failure, and he was removed to Bellevue Hospital, where he remained until November 12. He then finally gave the statement which corresponded with his testimony upon the trial, and which jibed with all the circumstances and evidence known to the district attorney. Did Patrick conspire with Jones to murder Rice? What corroboration is there of Jones's story that he killed Rice under Patrick's direction? First, what proof is there that murder was committed? Roughly, that Jones so swore that Rice died at the time alleged, that he did not die from disease, but that he died from a congestion of the lungs which could have occurred only in the case of a living organism by the administration of some such irritant as chloroform, that someone, therefore, must have killed him, and that Jones alone had the opportunity. Second, what proof is there that Patrick directed the murder? Evidence of an elaborate conspiracy, as briefly heretofore set forth, which contemplated the death of Rice. Of course Patrick wanted Rice to die. If Patrick was not implicated in the killing, what motive had Jones to commit the deed? Why did Rice die at the precise psychological moment which would enable Patrick to prevent $250,000 on deposit being diverted to Texas? And finally, why did Patrick prepare a forged cremation letter for the destruction of the body? If the conspiracy contemplated a natural death, nothing could be of greater value to the two parties concerned than the means of proving that the death was not unnatural. This, in the most abbreviated form, is the case against Patrick. Space forbids any reference to his elaborate and ingenious defense, which was based entirely on an alleged complete failure of corroboration of Jones's testimony. Starting with the premise that the word of a self-confessed murderer and thrice perjured scoundrel was valueless as proof, he contended that there was no adequate evidence that Rice's death was felonious, and that the congestion of the lungs could have been and was caused by the embalming fluid and was only attributed to the chloroform after Jones had given his final version of how the murder was accomplished. Technically, the case against Patrick was not a strong one. Dramatically, it was overwhelming. His own failure to testify and his refusal to allow his lawyer, Mr. House, to relate what passed between them in the tombs remain significant, although not evidence proper for a jury to consider. Wherever lawyers shall get together, there the Patrick case will be discussed with its strong points and its weak ones, its technicalities and its tactics, and the ethics of the liberation of Jones, the actual murderer, now long since vanished into the obscurity from which he came. On the one hand stands a public convinced of Patrick's guilt, and on the other the convicted lifer pointing a lean finger at the valet Jones and stubbornly repeating, "I am innocent." For in 1906 the governor of New York commuted the death sentence of Albert T. Patrick to life imprisonment, and the most extraordinary struggle in the legal history of the state on the part of a convicted murderer for his own life came to an end. The defendant in the death house at Sing Sing had invoked every expedient to escape punishment, and by the use of his knowledge had even saved a fellow prisoner, Mike Brush, from the electric chair. Story 9. The Forgotten Phone Booth. The payphone hadn't worked in years. That's what everyone in Millfield said about the old glass and steel booth at the edge of town, its receiver dangling by a frayed cord. The phone company had disconnected service back in 1998. The vinyl directory was yellowed and peeling, the metal buttons rusted in place. Yet every Thursday at 3:33 a.m., the phone rang. Old Jim Weller, the night janitor at the gas station across the street, was the first to notice. He'd hear the shrill ringing cutting through the silent pre-dawn, watch the booth's single bulb flicker to life. The first time he answered, he hung up after 3 seconds, his face white as chalk. He never spoke about what he heard. Then came the teenagers, bored, curious, daring each other to pick up when the ringing started. They'd emerge shaking, some crying, all refusing to repeat what the voice on the other end had said. The pattern was always the same. The phone rings exactly 7 times. The receiver feels unnaturally cold. A woman's voice asks the same question. The line goes dead with a sound like a gasp. I decided to answer it myself last week. The moment my fingers touched the receiver, my breath fogged in the booth despite the warm night. The voice was clear as crystal, feminine but somehow wrong, like multiple people speaking in perfect unison. Can you tell me where I left my keys? Then the dial tone. Not the modern digital beep, but the old mechanical buzz from decades past. At the library, I found the microfilm records. On September 12, 1997, a woman named Lillian Moss disappeared from that very phone booth. Witnesses reported seeing her frantic, patting her pockets, asking passers-by if they'd seen her car keys. The last call she ever made was to her husband, a panicked, broken connection where she kept repeating "I think I'm lost" before the line cut out. Her abandoned car was found 3 days later, keys still in the ignition, parked just 50 feet from the phone booth. The phone's ringing again tonight. I think I'll answer one more time. Maybe this time I'll tell her where the keys are. Note found folded inside the phone booth's directory, dated the morning after the author's disappearance. Story 10. A case of circumstantial evidence. In the town of Culiano, in the province of Solano, in Italy, there dwelt a widow by the name of Torsili, with her 2 sons, Vito and Antonio. The boys loved their mother devotedly and were no less fond of each other, the height of their ambition being to earn enough money to support her in comfort without need of working in her old age. As it was, she arose before light, made the fire, cooked their breakfast and labored in and about the house all day until they returned from the fields. But she was getting old and at last became bedridden and infirm. She could no longer cook the meals, and the boys had to shift for themselves. Moreover, instead of finding her standing at the door with a smile on her wrinkled face, welcoming them to supper on their return, the fire was always out. And their mother lay on her couch, no less glad to see them, to be sure, but no longer able to amuse them or minister to their comfort. Then the taxes were increased and hard times came. By 2s and 3s the men of the village packed their bundles, bade goodbye to their friends and families, and left the town, some to seek work in other parts of Italy, but most of them to take the big iron steamships for America, where work was easy and money plentiful. Sadly the boys watched their comrades depart. They would have liked to go, too, to seek their fortunes in this new land of promise, but they could not leave their mother. The following year some of the men who had gone away to America returned in fine clothes and with full purses to tell of the wonderful country beyond the seas, where one could always earn his 10 lire every day and do as he liked. Viva la libertà! They cried, pounding the tables in the cafe. Come, comrades. We have plenty of money. Drink to the great country of America. Vito and Antonio listened with envy. One evening the elder brother asked Antonio to come to walk with him. When they had gone a little way he said suddenly, "Tony, I think I shall go to this America. We need more money to make our mother comfortable. If we wait until she is dead the money will be of no use. You can stay here, and when I have made a place for you and her, you shall bring her on the ship to the new country." Vito was 5 years older than Antonio, and his word had always been law to the younger brother, so although he was sick at heart at the thought of being left behind, he said nothing against the project, but tried to make it easy for Vito with their mother. The old woman could not bear the thought of her firstborn leaving her, and declared, with the tears running down her face, that she should never see him again, but at last she yielded to their persuasions and gave Vito her blessing. It would be only a little while before she and Tony would join him, and they would be happy ever after. Then Tony was left alone with his mother. Every day he arose at the first streak of dawn, prepared breakfast, cleaned the house, saw that his mother was comfortable and then started off for the fields. A month went by, 2 months, 3, a year, but no word came from Vito. Tony assured the poor old woman that they would certainly hear from him the next week or the next, but cruel fear had taken possession of him. Something had happened to his brother. The years swept on. Their mother became more and more helpless. Antonio was obliged to hire a woman to care for her as nurse for a small sum, but it was just enough to leave only a pittance for them to live on. Tony grew thin and haggard. Where Could Vito be? Was he alive or dead? Next to his love for Nicoletta Lupero, it became the great passion of his life to learn what had become of Vito. He had known Nicoletta from a child, and their love had followed as naturally as summer follows spring. It had always been Tony and Nicoletta ever since he could remember. But she was growing up, and from a boy he had become a man. Yet how could he marry when he could hardly earn enough to support his mother and himself? They talked it over time and time again. If Vito would only return, or good times come, it might be possible. But meantime there was nothing to do. But wait. Nicoletta blossomed into womanhood. Had she not been betrothed, she would have been called an old maid. Neither she nor Tony took any part in the village merrymakings. Why should they? He was 30 and she 25. They might have married 10 years ago had not the elder brother gone away. Tony secretly feared that the time would never come when they would be man and wife, but he patiently labored on earning his 2 lire, or at most 2 lire and a half, a day. Then a man returned from America just for the harvest to see his family. He said that Vito was alive. He had not seen him himself, but others had seen him, and he was rich. He told of the plentifulness of gold in America, where everyone was comfortable and could lay up a fortune. He himself had saved over 5,000 lire in 4 years and owned a 1/3 interest in a fruit store. He was going to take his brother's family back with him, all of them. They would be rich, too, in a little while. A man was a fool to stay in Italy. Why did not Tony come back with him? He would get him a place on the railroad where one of his friends was padrone. Tony discussed it all with Nicoletta, and she talked with the man herself. "Tony," she said at length, "why do you not go? Here you are earning nothing. There you could save in a month enough to keep your mother in comfort for a year. You have to pay the nurse, and that takes a great deal. While you are here it would cause talk if I came to live in your home to care for your mother, but if you go away I can do so without comment and it will cost nothing. Perhaps you will find Vito. If not, you will soon make enough to send for both your mother and me." "You are a good girl," he answered, kissing her, "but I could not shift the responsibility of my mother to your shoulders. Still, I will talk to Father Giuseppe about it." The priest thought well of the plan. He was a little excited over America himself, and agreed to break the matter to the mother. She begged Tony piteously not to go. He was her only surviving son. Vito was dead. Let him but wait a little while and she would not be there to stand in his way. Then the priest added his personal assurance that it would be for the best. And the mother finally gave way. Tony was obliged to tear himself away by force from the arms of the old woman lying upon the bed, and her feeble sobs echoed in his ears as he trudged down the road with the scarf Nicoletta had worked about his neck, and a small bundle of his tools and most precious possessions on his shoulder. A couple of miles farther on came another harrowing parting with his betrothed, and from the top of the next rise beyond he could see Nicoletta still standing at the crossroads gazing pitifully after him. Thus many an Italian, for good or ill, has left the place of his birth for the mysterious land of the Golden West. The voyage was for Antonio an unalloyed agony of seasickness and homesickness, and when at last the great vessel steamed slowly up the North River, her band playing and the emigrants crowding eagerly to her sides, he had hardly spirit enough left to raise his eyes to the mountains of huge buildings, from whose craters the white smoke rose slowly and blew away in great wind-torn clouds. Yet he felt some of the awakening enthusiasm of his comrades, and when once his feet touched earth again it was not long before he almost forgot his sufferings upon the ocean in his feverish anxiety to lose no time in beginning to save the money which should reunite him to Nicoletta and his mother. As soon as the vessel had docked, a blustering Italian came among the emigrants and tagged a few dozen of them, including Antonio, with large blue labels, and then led them in a long, straggling line across the gangplank and marched them through the muddy streets to the railroad train. Here they huddled in a dirty car, filled with smoke, and were whirled with frightful speed for hours through a flat and smiling country. The noise, the smoke, and the unaccustomed motion made Antonio ill again, and when the train stopped at Lambertville, New Jersey, the padrone had difficulty in rousing him from the animal-like stupor into which he had fallen. The Italians crowded together upon the platform, gazing helplessly at one another and at the padrone, who was cursing them for a lot of stupid fools, and bidding them get upon a flat car that stood upon a siding. Antonio had to be pushed upon it by main force, but the journey this time was short, and in half an hour he found himself upon an embankment where hundreds of Italians were laboring with pick and shovel in the broiling sun. Here he also was given a pick and told to go to work. Tony soon became accustomed to his new surroundings. Every night he and the rest were carried to Lambertville on flat cars, and in the mornings were brought back to the embankment. The work was no harder than that to which he had been used, and he soon became himself again. Moreover, he found many of his old friends from Giuliano working there. In the evenings they walked through the streets of the town or sat under the trees playing mora and taco. His letters home were quite enthusiastic regarding the pleasant character of the life. To be sure, he could not write himself, but his old friend Antonio Strollo, who had lived at Valva, only a mile from Giuliano, acted as his amanuensis. He was very fond of Strollo, who was a dashing fellow, very merry, and quite the beau of the colony, in his wonderful red socks and neckties of many colors. Strollo could read and write, and, besides, he knew Antonio's mother and Nicoletta, and when Tony found himself unable to express his thoughts, Strollo helped him out. When the answers came, he read them to Tony and joined in the latter's pleasure. Tony himself soon became a favorite in Lambertville, for he was simple and gentle, and full of goodwill for everybody. He was very good-looking, too, with his handsome Roman profile, snapping black eyes and black curly locks. Yet he was sad always, especially so as since his arrival in America he had made no progress toward finding Vito. From time to time he met other Italians who had been working elsewhere, who thought they had seen him or someone that looked like him. But inquiry always elicited the fact that their desire to give him encouragement was greater than the accuracy of their memories. Of course, Antonio Strollo, who had become Tony's inseparable friend, shared all his eagerness to find Vito. In fact, Tony had no thought that he did not confide to his friend, and it was really the latter who composed the love letters to Nicoletta and the affectionate epistles to the mother. Every month Tony divided what he earned into 3 parts. One of them he deposited in the savings bank, another he invested in a money order which was sent by Strollo to Nicoletta for the mother, and the last he kept for himself. It was astounding how fast one really could make money if one was industrious. $40 a month, sometimes. That made nearly 70 lire to send to Nicoletta. His bank account grew steadily, and he often saved something out of the money he allowed himself to live upon. Antonio Strollo, on the other hand, was lazy and spent all his wages on Chianti, neckties, waistcoats, and gambling. Sometimes he would do nothing for a whole month but loiter around the streets smoking cigars and ogling the village girls. These last were afraid of him and called him the daredevil. Tony worked on the embankment for 3 years, sending his money with a letter to Nicoletta every month. The mother still lived and Nicoletta was giving up her own life to take care of her, but the old woman was very feeble and no longer had any hope of seeing either of her sons again. Moreover, she was now so bedridden that it was useless to think of trying to move her, even if Tony had plenty of money. No, as soon as he was satisfied that Vito could not be found and had saved enough money, he must return. How she begged him to return. As Strollo read him the girl's letters, Tony wept bitter tears and Strollo wept likewise in sympathy. But no word came of Vito. Tony, anxious about his mother, despairing of ever finding his brother, pining for Nicoletta, and with $300 lying in the savings bank, decided to return to Italy. But if only he could find Vito first. Then Antonio Strollo had an idea. Why not advertise, he suggested. He wondered that they had never thought of it before. They would put a notice in Il Progresso, the Italian paper in New York, and see what would come of it. Tony agreed that the idea was good, so Strollo wrote the notice offering a reward for news of Vito. 2 months passed, once more Tony gave up hope, and then, oh never to be forgotten day. A letter came from the post office from Vito. Tony threw his arms about Strollo and kissed him for joy. Vito was found at last. The letter, dated Yonkers, New York, told how Vito had by chance heard of Tony's notice and learned that he was in America. He himself, he said, had prospered and was a padrone, employing many workmen on the waterworks. He begged Tony for news of their mother. He confessed himself an ungrateful son never to have written, but he had married and had had children, and he had assumed that she was being cared for by his brother. Tony must forgive him and come to him at once. "Oh Dio!" cried Tony, the tears in his eyes. "Forgive him? Of course I will forgive him. Come, Antonio, let us write my dear brother a letter without delay and tell him that our mother is still alive. How should I like to see his wife and babies?" So they prepared a long letter which Strollo took to the post office himself and mailed. Tony went back to work with joy in his heart and whistled and sang all day long, and, of course, he wrote all about it to Nicoletta. He was only waiting for his month to be up before starting. Then he would go to Yonkers, make Vito a little visit, and return home to Italy. It would be easy enough, after that, for Vito would send them money, if necessary, to live upon. Several letters passed between the brothers, and at the end of the month Tony drew out his money from the bank, received his wages in full, and prepared to leave Lambertville. Meantime a letter had come from Nicoletta telling of his mother's joy at learning that Vito was still alive. As Tony had doubts as to his ability to find his way to Yonkers, Strollo kindly offered to accompany him. Tony had made many friends during his 3 years' stay in Lambertville, and he promised to write to them and tell them about Vito and his family, so it was agreed that the letter should be sent to Sabato Gizzi, in whose house he had lived, and that Gizzi should read it to the others. The address was written carefully on a piece of paper and given to Tony. So early in the morning of August 16, 1903, Tony and Strollo took the train for New York. It was a hot day, and once again the motion and speed made Tony feel ill, but the thought of seeing Vito buoyed him up, and by the time they had crossed the ferry and had actually reached New York he was very hungry. In his excitement he had forgotten to eat any breakfast and was now beginning to feel faint. But Strollo said it was a long way to Yonkers and that they must not stop For many hours they trudged the streets without getting anywhere, and then Strollo said it was time to take the cars. Tony was very tired, and he had to climb many flights of stairs to the train. It carried them a long distance, past miles of tenement houses and vacant lots, and at last into a sort of country. Strollo said they should get out. It was very hot and Tony was weak from weariness and lack of food, but his heart was light and he followed Strollo steadily down the Wilding road. After going about a mile they crossed some fields near where people were playing a game at hitting little balls with sticks. It was astonishing how far they could strike the balls entirely out of sight. "Is this Yonkers?" asked Tony. "It is near here," answered Strollo. "We are going by a short way." They entered some thick woods and came out upon another field. Tony was now so faint that he begged his friend to stop. "Can we not get some food?" he inquired. "I can hardly walk." "There is a man in that field," said Strollo. "Go and ask him." So Tony plodded over to the man who was digging mushrooms and asked him in broken English where they could get something to eat. The man told him that it was a long way. They would have to take the trolley to Yonkers. There was a restaurant there called the Promised Land, where one could get Italian dishes. He seemed to take a kindly interest in Tony and in Strollo, who had remained some distance behind, and Tony gave him a cigar cremo, the last one he had. Then Strollo led the way back into the woods. It was almost sunset, and the long, low beam slanting through the tree trunks made it hard to see. They went deeper and deeper into the woods. Presently, Strollo, who was leading the way, stopped and said, "We are going in the wrong direction. We must turn around and go back." Tony turned. As he did so, Strollo drew a long knife and plunged it again and again through Tony's body. Strollo spent that night, under an assumed name, at the Mills Hotel in Bleecker Street. He had stabbed himself accidentally in the knee and also in the left hand. In the fury of his attack, and when he arose in the morning, the sheets were covered with blood. There was also blood on his shoes, which had been new, but he took his knife and scraped it off. He had experienced a strange sort of terrified exaltation the night before, and in the early light as he crept downstairs and out of the hotel he could not have told whether he were more glad or afraid. For he had $300 in his pocket, more than he had ever seen at any one time before, as much as a man could save in 2 whole years. He would be a king now for a long time. He need not work. He could eat, drink and play cards. And read some books he had heard about. As for finding him out, never. The police would not even know who Torsilli was, to say nothing of who had killed him, for he had removed, as he thought, everything in Tony's pockets. There would be a dead man in the morgue, that was all. He could go back to Lambertville and say that he had left Tony with his brother at Yonkers, and that would be the end of it. First, though, he would buy some new clothes. It was very early and the shops were hardly open, but he found one place where he could buy a suit, another some underclothes, and a third a pair of shoes. The shoemaker, who was a thrifty man, asked Strollo what was the matter with the shoes he had on, so Strollo craftily said they hurt his feet. Then he ate a hearty breakfast, and bought a better cigar than he had ever smoked before. There was a bookstore nearby and he purchased some books, Alto Amore and Sua Maesta e Sua Moneta, The Height of Love and His Majesty and His Money. He would read them on the train. He felt warm and comfortable now, and not afraid at all. By and by he went back on the train to Lambertville and smoked and read all the way, contented as the tiger is contented which has tracked down and slain a water buffalo. The same afternoon about sunset, in a lonely part of Van Cortlandt Park, the mushroom digger stumbled over Torsielli's body lying face downward among the leaves. He recognized it as that of the man who had asked the way to something to eat and given him a cigar. He ran from the site and, pallid with fear, notified the nearest police officer. Then things took the usual course. The body was removed to the morgue, an autopsy was performed, and headquarters took charge of the case. As the deceased was an Italian, Detective Sergeant Petrosina was called in. Torsielli's pockets were empty save for the band of a Cremo cigar in one waistcoat pocket and a tiny slip of paper in another, on which was penciled Sabato Gizzi, P.O. Box 239, Lambertville, New Jersey. Whether this last was the name of the deceased, the murderer, or someone else, no one knew. Headquarters said it was a blind case, but Petrosina shrugged his shoulders and bought a ticket to Lambertville. Here he found Sabato Gizzi, who expressed genuine horror at learning of Tony's death and readily accompanied Petrosina to New York, where he identified the body as indeed that of Torsielli. He told Petrosina that Tony had left Lambertville in the company of Strollo on Thursday, August 16. This was Saturday, August 18, and less than 36 hours after the murder. Strollo, reading Alto Amore, and drinking in the saloon, suspected nothing. New York was 70 miles away, too far for any harm to come. But Monday morning, walking lazily down the street near the railroad station, Strollo found himself suddenly confronted by a heavily built man with a round, moon-shaped face, thickly covered with pock marks. Strollo did not like the way the latter's gimlet-like eyes looked him over. There was no time to turn and fly, and, besides, Strollo had no fear. They might come and ask him questions, and he might even admit almost all, and they could do nothing, for no one had seen what he had done to Tony in the wood. So Strollo returned Petrosina's gaze unflinchingly. "Are you Antonio Strollo?" asked the detective, coming close to the murderer. "Yes, certainly, I am Antonio Strollo," replied the latter. "Do you know Antonio Torsielli?" continued Petrosina. "To be sure," answered Strollo. "I knew him well," he added almost insolently. "Why did you accompany him to New York?" inquired Petrosina sharply. Strollo paled. He had not known that the police were aware of the fact. "I had errands in the city. I needed clothes," said Strollo. "He has been murdered," said Petrosina quietly. "Will you come to New York to identify the body?" Strollo hesitated. "Why, yes, certainly. I will go to New York." Then he added, thinking that his words seemed insufficient, "I am sorry if Torsielli has been murdered, for he was a friend of mine." There was a wait of several hours before the train started for New York, and Strollo utilized it by giving Petrosina a detailed account of his trip with Torsielli. He took his time about it and thought each statement over very carefully before he made it, for he was a clever fellow, this Strollo. He even went into the family history of Torsielli and explained about the correspondence with the long-lost brother, in which he acted as amanuensis, for he had come to the conclusion that, in the long run, honesty, up to a certain point, would prove the best policy. Thus, he told the detective many things which the latter did not know or even suspect. Strollo's account of what had happened was briefly as follows. He and Tony had reached New York about 12 o'clock and had spent an hour or so in the neighborhood of Mott Street looking at the parade of San Rocco. Then they had started for Yonkers and gone as far as the terminal of the 2nd Avenue L. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They had got out and started to walk. As they proceeded, they suddenly had seen a man standing under a tree, and Torsili had said to Strollo, "That man standing under that tree looks like my brother." Strollo had replied, "You know I am not acquainted with your brother." As they reached the tree, the stranger had stepped forward and said to Torsili, "Who are you?" "Who? Me. My name is Antonio Torsili," had been the reply. "Who are you?" "I am Vito Torsili," had answered the stranger. Then the two had rushed into each other's arms. "And what did you do?" inquired Petrosina, as Strollo naively concluded this extraordinary story. "Me," answered Strollo innocently. "Why, there was nothing for me to do, so I went back to New York." Petrosina said nothing, but bided his time. He had now several important bits of evidence. By Strollo's own account, he had been with the deceased in the general locality of the murder shortly before it occurred. He had given no adequate explanation of why he was in New York at all, and he was now fabricating a preposterous falsehood to show that he had left his victim before the homicide was committed. On the train, Petrosina began to tie up some of the loose ends. He noticed the wound on Strollo's hand and asked where it had been obtained. The suspect replied that he had received it at the hands of a drunken man in Mott Street. He even admitted having stayed at the Mills Hotel the same evening under an assumed name, and gave as an excuse that his own name was difficult for an American to pronounce and write. Later, this information led to the finding of the bloody bedclothes. He denied, however, having changed his clothes or purchased new ones, and this the detective was obliged to ferret out for himself, which he did by visiting or causing to be visited almost every Italian shop upon the east side. Thus the incident of the shoes was brought to light. Strollo was at once taken to the morgue on reaching the city, and here for the first time his nerve failed him, for he could not bring himself to inspect the ghastly body of his victim. "Look," cried Petrosina, "is that the man?" "Yes, yes," answered the murderer, trembling like a leaf. "That is he." "You are not looking at him," said the detective. "Why don't you look at him? Look at the body." "I am looking at him," replied Strollo, averting his eyes. "That is he, my friend. Antonio Torsili." The prisoner was now taken to police headquarters and searched. Here a letter was found in his hip pocket in his own handwriting, purporting to be from Antonio Torsili to his brother Vito at Yonkers, but enclosed in an envelope addressed to Antonio at Lambertville. This envelope bore a red 2-cent stamp and was inscribed, "Antonio Torsili, Box 470, Lambertville, New Jersey." The letter, as later translated in court by the interpreter, read as follows: "Lambertville, July 30, 1905. My dear brother, upon receipt of your news I feel very happy to feel you are well, and the same I can assure you from me. Dear brother, you cannot believe the joy I feel after such a long time to know where you are. I have been looking for you for 2 years, and never had any news from you. I could not, as you wrote to me, to come to you, because I had no money, and then I didn't know where to go, because I have been always in the country. Know that what little money I have I sent it to mother, because if I don't help her nobody will, as you never write to her. I believe not to abandon her, because she is our mother, and we don't want her cursed. So then, if you like to see me, you come and take me. You spoke to me about work thither, but I don't understand about that work which you say, and then what will I do, because here I have work. Therefore, if you think I can come and work with you, let me know, because I have the address. But if you want to do better, you come and take me. Dear brother, I remind you about our mother. Because I don't earn enough money, which she is your mother also. Dear brother, I hope you did not forget our mother. Dear brother, let me know the names of your children, and I kiss them. Many regards to your wife and aunt. I beg you to write to me. Dear regards, your brother, Antonio Torsili. When you answer, send the answer to the address below, Antonio Strallo. Strallo made no attempt to explain the possession of this letter, which, if sent at all, would naturally have come into the possession of the addressee. And what was Vito's address at Yonkers? Inquired Petrosina. 1570 Yonkers, answered Strallo. Is that the street number of a house or a post office number? Asked the detective. Neither, said Strallo. Just 1570 Yonkers. Thus the infamy of this villain was made manifest. He had invented out of his own brain the existence of Vito Torsili in Yonkers, and had himself written the letters to Antonio which purported to come from him. He had used the simple fellow's love for his long-lost brother as the means to lure him to his destruction, and brutally murdered him for the sake of the few dollars which his innocent victim had worked so hard to earn to reunite him to his mother and his betrothed. The wounds in Strallo's hand and knee were found to correspond in shape and character with the 36 wounds in Torsili's body, and the mushroom digger unhesitatingly identified him as the man in the company of the deceased. Upon the afternoon of the murder, it almost seemed like the finger of Providence indicating the assassin when the last necessary piece of evidence in this extraordinary case was discovered. Petrosini had hurried to Lambertville immediately upon the discovery of the letter and visited the post office. A young lady named Miss Olive Phillips had been employed there as a clerk for 12 years, and had lately had charge of what are known as the call boxes. That is to say, of boxes to which no keys are issued, but for the contents of which the lessees have to ask at the delivery window. These are very inexpensive and in use generally by the Italian population of Lambertville, who are accustomed to rent them in common one box to 3 or 4 families. She had noticed Strallo when he had come for his mail on account of his flashy dress and debonair demeanor. Strallo's box, she said, was number 420. Petrosina showed her the envelope of the letter found in Strallo's pocket. The stamp indicated that it had been cancelled at Lambertville on July 26. When she saw the envelope, she called Petrosina's attention to the fact that the stamp was a 2-cent red stamp, and said, to his surprise, that she was able to identify the letter on that account as one mailed by Strallo on July 26. As there is no local delivery in the town, she explained, drop letters, or letters mailed by residents to other residents, may be franked for 1 cent. Now, in the first place, no Italian in Lambertville, except Strallo, so far as Miss Phillips could remember, had ever mailed a letter to another Italian in the same town. A frugal Italian, moreover, if he had done so, would have put on only the required amount of postage. On the 26th of July, Strallo had come to the post office and pushed this identical letter through the window, at the same time handing her 2 cents and asking her to put on a red stamp for him. She had been surprised at this, and had at first thought of calling his attention to the fact that only a 1-cent stamp was necessary, but she had refrained and put on the stamp. At the same time she had noticed that it was addressed to Antonio Torsili, Lambertville, New Jersey. Strallo had then taken the letter and slipped it into the drop, and she had cancelled the stamp, taking the opportunity to examine the letter a second time. A stranger coincidence could hardly be imagined, and this observing young lady from the country was thus able to supply the most important link in the chain against the murderer, and to demonstrate conclusively that the wretch had himself been mailing in Lambertville the letters purporting to come from the fictitious brother in Yonkers. Strollo was now placed in the house of detention as a witness, a course frequently pursued when it is desirable to prevent a suspect from knowing that he is accused. The case against him was practically complete, for it did not seem humanly possible that any jury would hesitate to convict him upon the evidence, but juries are loath to find anyone guilty of murder in the first degree upon purely circumstantial evidence, and this was the first purely circumstantial case in a long time. Inspector Price, therefore, conceived the idea of trapping Strollo into a confession by placing a detective in confinement with him under the guise of being a fellow prisoner. It was, of course, patent that Strollo was but a child mentally, but he was shrewd and sly, and if he denied his guilt, there was still a chance of his escape. Accordingly, a detective named Repetto was assigned to the disagreeable task of taking the part of an accused criminal. He was detailed to the house of detention and remained there for 5 days, from September 8 to September 13. Here Repetto became acquainted with Strollo and the other prisoners, giving his name as Silvio del Sordo and his address as 272 Bowery. He played cards with them, read the papers aloud and made himself generally agreeable. During this period he frequently saw the defendant write and familiarized himself with his chirography. The scheme worked and Repetto afterward received 5 letters from Strollo, sent after the latter had been removed from the house of detention to the Tombs, and indicted for the murder of Torsielli. The first, dated September 22d, was merely to inform his supposed friend Silvio of the change in his residence and to inquire the whereabouts of another prisoner named Philip. The second would be pathetic were it not written by the defendant in the case. It carries with it the flavor of the Calabrian Hills. New York, October 17, 1905. Sir Silvio, I write and believe not to sicken you with my words, but it is enough that you are well in health. I take the liberty again not having any one else but you, and I believe to find a brother in you, not a friend. I ask you nothing, only if you have time to come and see me as soon as possible. I ask you this as a favor because I know and believe to find a true friend, as I want to ask you a certain thing at the cost of my life. I will not say any more. Bring me 5 cents of paper and envelopes to write letters, and when you come I will give you the money. Nothing else. I am yours ever. Servant and perfect friend, Strollo. The third letter from the perfect friend to his equally perfect friend is an extraordinary combination of ingenuity and ignorance. It contains the only suggestion of a defense, that of an alibi. New York, October 30, 1905. Esteemed friend, with retard I answer in receiving yours. I was very, very glad. I believe all you told me, and I am grateful, and hope you will not betray me, because you know it will cost the life of a poor unfortunate. So do as you told me, keep things to ourselves. If you wish to help me you will do me a great service, and if God helps me, you can dispose of my life. So I will have you called unexpected, saying that I did not know if you remembered. So if you are called, the first thing you must do is to make believe to look at me, and then you say you remember of having seen me looking at the pictures in front of place where you work, and you asked me if I wanted my pictures taken, and I said no. If they ask at what time, say 5:20 or 5:30 p.m., and that you spoke with me for quite a while. If they ask how was he dressed, the coat was black, the shoes russet, the trousers with white stripes, which is the one I am now wearing, what tie, I don't remember, I only know he was well dressed. The hat was brown. If they ask did he have a mark on his hand, say no, he had a ring with a black stone. How many times did you see him? Say that after your work you were going around Mott Street and you saw me again, and how it was 8 o'clock or past 8 and you saw me with a handkerchief around my hand. And you said to me, why I had my hand so. And he answered that someone struck him. I asked if it hurt much. He said he did not feel it. Did both of you go to drink? No. Where else did Strollo go? Strollo said he was going at the Bleecker Street Hotel to sleep. Did you see him again? No. Nothing else. If you want to help me reflect, well, but you don't need any more words from me. Say just what I have said, and I hope, with faith of a brother not a friend, I am ever your friend. A. Strollo. It may, and probably will, appear to the reader that a clearer case of guilt could hardly be established, but the action of juries is always problematical, and this was a case composed entirely of circumstantial evidence. The jury would be obliged to find that no reasonable hypothesis consistent with the innocence of the accused could be formulated upon the evidence. Thus, even in the face of the facts proven against him, some freak juryman might still have said, but, after all, how do you know that Strollo killed him? Some other fellow might have done it. Even the faking of a defense does not prove the defendant guilty, but merely that he fears conviction, and is ready to resort to feigned testimony to secure his freedom. Many innocent men convict themselves in precisely this way. Accordingly, it was by no means with confidence that the people went to trial. But throughout this remarkable case it seemed as if it must have been preordained that Strollo should not escape punishment for his treacherous crime. No defense was possible, not even the partially prepared alibi was attempted. And the only thing that savored of a defense was the introduction of a letter, alleged to have been received by the defendant while in the house of detention, and which, if genuine, would have apparently established that the crime had been perpetrated by the Black Hand. The offering of this letter was a curious and fatal blunder, for it was later proven by the people to be in Strollo's own handwriting. It was his last despairing effort to escape the consequences of his crime. Headed with a cross drawn in blood, it ran as follows: I swear upon this cross, which is the blood of my veins, Strollo is innocent. I swear upon the cross the revengeful Black Hand could save me. New York, October 12, 1905. Sir Strollo, knowing you only by name, 8 days after that I leave. This letter will be sent to you. I leave at 7 o'clock with the steamer Britain. The harbor. Therefore I leave betraying my oath that I have held for the last 3 years belonging to the Black Hand. I will leave 3 letters, one to you, one to the police officer Capri, and the other to the law, 300 Mulberry Street. All what I am saying I have sworn to before God. Therefore your innocence will be given you, first by God and then by the law, capturing the true murderers. I am sure that they already captured the murderer of Torsielli, who lured you to come to New York was Giuseppe Rosa, who knew you for nearly 2 years, and who comes from Lambertville, came among us and played you a trick. He is a Calabrese and has a mighty grudge. He and 4 others are averse to them. Announce the name of the man who stabbed you with the knife was Antonio Villa. He had to kill you, but you was fortunate. He is in jail for the present time and I don't know for how long, but I know that he was arrested. Nothing else to say. I have done my duty in giving you all the information. 407 2nd Street, Jersey. First page of the Black Hand letter written by Strollo, and put in evidence at his trial, placing the murder of Torsili upon members of that imaginary secret organization. This letter convicted him. First page of the Black Hand letter. Written by Strollo, and put in evidence at his trial, placing the murder of Torsili upon members of that imaginary secret organization. This letter convicted him. It is clear from the letter that Strollo had formed a vague plan for his defense, which should, in part, consist of the claim that he, as well as Torsili, had been marked for death by the Black Hand, and that while both had been induced to come to New York, the plans of the assassins had in his case miscarried. The reader has already observed that purely for the purpose of securing his continued interest in the present narrative, the writer has, as it were, told his story backward, reserving as long as possible the fact that the finding of the beloved Vito was a pure fiction invented by the murderer. At the trial, however, the jury listened breathlessly while bit by bit the whole pathetic story was painted before them, like a mosaic picture. They heard first the story of the mushroom digger, there of the expedition of Petrosina to Lambertville, of the identification of Torsili's body, of the elaborate fabrications of Strollo, and in due course, of the telltale letter in the murderer's pocket. Gradually the true character of the defendant's crime came over them and they turned from him in aversion. The natural climax in the evidence was Miss Phillips' extraordinary identification of the defendant sitting at the bar as the man who had mailed upon the 26th of July, at the Lambertville post office, the envelope purporting to come from Yonkers, and containing the forged letter from the imaginary Vito. Strollo remained almost to the last confident that he could never be convicted. But when his own letters in prison were introduced in evidence, he turned ashen, pale, and stared fixedly at the judge. The jury deliberated but 15 minutes. Their functions consisting of but a single ballot, followed by a prayer for the wretched murderer's soul. Then they filed slowly back and, in the waning light of the summer afternoon just 1 year after the murder, and at the precise hour at which Strollo had killed his victim, pronounced him guilty of murder in the first degree. In due course his conviction was sustained by the Court of Appeals, and on March 11, 1908, he paid the penalty for his crime in the electric chair.